dear colleague, Ambassador Geraldine Byrne-Nason, Permanent Representative of Ireland. I have been informed that this is her last meeting in the UN Security Council. Geraldine, I am certain I speak for all of us around this table when I express my gratitude for our valuable cooperation and relationship in the United Nations. Particularly here at the Security Council, it has been an honor to work side by side with you to promote peace and security and to defend our shared deep belief in the UN Charter. With Ambassador Geraldine's competent leadership, Ireland has successfully promoted the core values of empathy, partnership, and independence here in the Security Council, and time and over again played an important role in building bridges, closing gaps, and reaching consensus. Since we held a meeting on peace building and sustaining peace this very week, I would like to highlight that during Ireland's presidency last September, you worked to bridge the critical gap between peacekeeping and peace building in leading the Council's first ever resolution on UN transitions. Geraldine has also been a champion of women's voices at the UN, not only at the Security Council, where we share commitments to make WPS a top priority, but also in other fora, for instance, as chair of the Commission on the Status of Women for 2 years. The Council, and indeed the entire United Nations, will miss your top-notch skills and negotiating prowess. We look forward to continue working with you, your team, and your successor, hoping our paths cross again shortly. I wish you and your family all the very best in Washington. As one would say in Irish, and please excuse my pronunciation, Gonai Rian Bor Lat. That is, may the road be successful for you. Thank you, Geraldine. The provisional agenda for this meeting is maintenance of peace and security in Ukraine. The agenda is adopted. In accordance with Rule 37 of the Council's Provisional Rules of Procedure, I invite the representatives of Germany, Italy, Latvia, Poland, Romania, Slovakia, and Ukraine to participate in this meeting. It is so decided. In accordance with Rule 39 of the Council's Provisional Rules of Procedure, I invite Ms. Rosemary DiCarlo, Under Secretary General for Political and Peace-Building Affairs, to participate in this meeting. It is so decided. In accordance with Rule 39 of the Council's Provisional Rules of Procedure, I invite Mr. Thibault Cameli, Chargé d'Affaires of the Delegation of the European Union to the United Nations, to participate in this meeting. It is so decided. The Security Council will now begin its consideration of item 2 of the agenda. I now give the floor to Ms. Rosemary DiCarlo.
Mr. President, the war triggered by the Russian invasion of Ukraine is over 5 months old and shows no signs of ending. Instead, the fighting is intensifying. In the face of such a grim prospect, the agreement signed on 22 July in Istanbul to facilitate the safe transportation of grain and foodstuffs from Ukrainian ports of Odessa, Chernomorsk, and Yuzhny constitutes a beacon of hope for humanity, as the Secretary General put it. This humanitarian agreement, together with the understanding between the Russian Federation and the UN Secretariat on promoting access of Russian food products and fertilizers to world markets, will help bridge the global food supply gap and reduce high prices. Member states received yesterday a virtual briefing on these efforts from Undersecretary General for Humanitarian Affairs and Emergency Relief Coordinator Martin Griffiths, and Undersecretary General and Executive Secretary of the Economic Commission for Africa, Vera Songwe. The grain agreement is a sign that dialogue between the parties is possible in the search to ease human suffering. The UN is now making every effort to support the parties in operationalizing the initiative, starting with the inauguration of the Joint Coordination Center 2 days ago. As the Secretary General has stated, all parties made clear commitments to ensure the safe movement of grain and related products to global markets. Avoiding incidents such as recent strikes on Odessa and creating enabling conditions will be key for the initiative to succeed. It is therefore imperative that the Russian Federation, Ukraine, and Turkey work in partnership to effectively implement the agreement. Mr. President, since I last briefed this Council on 28 June, the number of civilians killed, wounded, or maimed by fighting continued to grow. Deadly missile, air, and artillery attacks by Russian armed forces have continued unabated, reducing many Ukrainian cities and towns to rubble. The streets of Kharkiv, Dnipro, and Mykolaiv have been repeatedly targeted. The port city of Odessa and the surrounding region have also suffered multiple attacks. The capital of the Kirovohrad region was reportedly struck yesterday, as was the town of Lyutizh, just north of Kyiv. Cities in the Donbass, including Donetsk and Bakhmut, are also reported to be under fire. Renewed heavy fighting is now anticipated in Kherson and Zaporizhia regions. At the same time, reported efforts to alter administrative structures on the ground, including attempts to introduce local governing bodies in Russian-controlled areas, raise serious concerns about the political implications of the war. As the conflict enters a more protracted phase, attention is increasingly turning to its longer-term humanitarian, recovery, reconstruction, and socioeconomic impact. As summer wanes, the need for winterization planning is also becoming pressing. Regrettably, political dialogue has virtually ground to a halt. Mr. President, the war has taken an unacceptable toll on Ukrainian civilians. As of 27 July, the Office of the High Commissioner for Human Rights had recorded 12,272 civilian casualties in the country, 5,237 killed, and 7,035 injured. This represents at least 1,641 new civilian casualties since my last briefing. These figures are based on verified incidents. The actual numbers are considerably higher. As we have reported, most of the civilian casualties recorded were caused by explosive weapons with a wide impact area. Many of these weapons are inherently indiscriminate when used in populated areas, where they invariably have devastating humanitarian consequences. OHCHR, WHO, and UNESCO continue to document damage and destruction of civilian housing, educational healthcare facilities, as well as places of worship. The impact of war on Ukraine's health sector is particularly alarming. As of 25 July, there have been 414 attacks on healthcare in Ukraine, resulting in 85 deaths and 100 injuries. This includes 350 attacks on facilities in areas of conflict, where on average, around 316,000 patients were treated per month. Also, UNESCO has verified conflict-related damage to 168 cultural sites since 24 February, including 73 religious buildings and 13 museums. Some 2,129 educational institutions have also reportedly suffered from bombing and shelling. Indiscriminate attacks against civilians and civilian infrastructure are a clear violation of international humanitarian and human rights law. We reiterate our urgent call to all parties to to respect these laws, including the rules of distinction, proportionality, and precaution, and to avoid the use of heavy weapons in populated areas. Mr. President, as of 20 July, the humanitarian community has provided aid to 11 million people. Some 9 million people have received food and livelihood assistance, and more than 4.5 million people have benefited from protection services, including legal assistance, mine clearance, and mine risk reduction. More than 4.2 million people have also been able to access safe water and proper sanitation, while nearly 2.3 million people have received cash assistance. Despite difficulties in reaching people in need in the non-government controlled areas of Donetsk and Luhansk, humanitarian partners have provided aid to up to 125,000 people and to over 30 health, education, and social institutions in the area. Mr. President, as of 19 July, 5,984,263 refugees from Ukraine were recorded across Europe. Border crossings from Ukraine since 24 February have totaled over 9.5 million. Crossings to Ukraine numbered 3.8 million. We are concerned that winter will make it harder for the displaced or the returnee community to have access to shelter and health care. To address these risks, the humanitarian community is focusing on supporting the national and local systems to respond with housing solutions, social protection, and economic inclusion. Mr. President, we cannot ignore the specific way the war is affecting women and girls. While access to food has significantly declined across Ukraine, women-headed households in Ukraine are twice as likely to experience food insecurity as those headed by men. Women's access to health services, including sexual and reproductive health, is rapidly deteriorating, as is access to newborn and child health. With access to education also largely hindered, women are taking on the primary responsibility of homeschooling children. Further, women in Ukraine face significantly increased safety and protection risks. Incidents of gender-based violence, including allegations of sexual violence in conflict, have increased, but services for survivors are not provided in full. It's also likely that many victims and survivors are currently unable to report their cases. Especially for these reasons, women must meaningfully participate in discussions and initiatives to shape the future of the country, including peace negotiations, recovery efforts, peace building, and accountability efforts. Mr. President, the impact of the war globally is glaringly clear. The consequences will only become more pronounced the longer the conflict lasts, particularly with the onset of winter. Despite the encouraging developments on grain and fertilizers, we remain deeply concerned about the lack of prospects for a shift towards a meaningful resumption of diplomatic efforts to end the war. Escalatory rhetoric from any side, including about expanding the conflict geographically or denying Ukraine's statehood, is not consistent with the constructive spirit demonstrated in Istanbul. Here, let me state once again the commitment of the United Nations to Ukraine's sovereignty, territorial integrity, and independence within its internationally recognized borders. Mr. President, we are all aware of the horrors of this war. In both government and non-government controlled areas, ordinary people bear the brunt of attacks and counterattacks. 2 weeks ago, the city of Vinnytsia became the scene of another atrocious attack. Missiles fired from the Black Sea killed over 20 people, including 3 children. Among those brutally cut down in the attack was a 4-year-old girl, Lisa, who had been strolling through a park with her mother. We know the heartbreaking story of her killing, but there are many other children, fathers, and mothers dying in similar circumstances every day in Ukraine. This incident and the long list of attacks devastating Ukraine will stand as the ultimate indictment of the utter senselessness and brutality of this war. Thank you, Mr. President.
I thank Ms. DiCarlo for her briefing. I now give the floor to the members of the Security Council. I give the floor to the representative of Albania.
Thank you, Mr. President, and let me just start by thanking you, Ronaldo, for the thoughtful remarks on behalf of the Council. For Geraldine, I echo your words and I reiterate my personal pleasure and honor to have had the chance to work with such a seasoned diplomat and wish you all the best. Let me thank USG DiCarlo for this update on Ukraine. The Russian aggression has entered its 6th month. It constitutes a blatant breach of the international law and the UN Charter, as it is aiming to wipe Ukraine from the map, is destroying cities, railroad, bridges, government offices, hospitals, schools, cultural monuments, industry, farms, and ports. Everything is under attack. Because this war is attacking the quintessence of Ukraine's economy. It is assaulting the backbone of the country. Colleagues, Article 2 of the UN Charter prohibits the use of force against the sovereignty and territorial integrity of another state. Russia violates it. ICJ issued last month an order calling Russia to immediately halt its military operation in Ukraine. Russia disregards it. The UN General Assembly called on Russia on the 2nd of March to stop the war. Russia ignores it. Russia continues to claim that there is no war in Ukraine, and as recently as last month, the foreign minister told the BBC that his country had not invaded Ukraine, despite more than 12,000 and counting civilian victims, despite uninterrupted shelling with widespread and deliberate destruction of civilian infrastructure, despite vast Ukrainian land temporarily occupied through massive bombardments and a scorched earth campaign, which amounts close to 20% of the territory of Ukraine that is not under the control of a legitimate government elected by the people of Ukraine, not chosen by the Kremlin. Just because we are used to this mantra here and elsewhere, this doesn't make it less outrageous. Whatever Russia may say, there is no legal ground, no moral justification, or any other possible excuse for this unprovoked war of aggression, because it is a pure act of aggression. Colleagues, we remain concerned about steps Russia is taking to institutionalize and perpetuate control in the occupied territories in Ukraine by a policy of social engineering. The Moscow-imposed authorities in Kherson say that they plan to ask the Kremlin to formally annex the region to Russia. The response comes in the form of, and I quote, "locals should decide their own fate," end of quote, which credits reports that Russia may be planning to hold a referendum in the city. Russia is already introducing its own currency, media and internet services into Kherson and other occupied parts of Ukraine, just like it did in Crimea. The same old playbook. No need to reinvent the wheel for territory grab. By doing so, Russia has again outdone itself in the assembly line of artificial entities that has become its modus operandi, as we have seen before, by staging fake referendums or any other such form of sham legal simulation to mushroom pseudo-republics here and there. Annexation by force is and will remain a violation of the UN Charter. It will bear consequences for those responsible in the framework of the accountability process, and it will not be accepted. Any purported annexation, whatever its cover, is premeditated, illegal, and illegitimate. We remain equally concerned by reports of forced population transfers, including hundreds of thousands of children via the so-called filtration process. As described in detail in the report of the OSCE Moscow mechanism released earlier this month, more than 1.4 million Ukrainians have been transferred into Russia, passing through the so-called filtration centers. Let's recall that mass forcible transfer of civilians during a conflict to the territory of the occupying party is prohibited under the 1949 Geneva Conventions. It constitutes a war crime. We reiterate our call on Russia to stop the war, to withdraw its forces from Ukraine's internationally recognized borders and territorial waters. Dear colleagues, we don't need reminding the war in Ukraine is also having a devastating global impact. By deliberately destroying Ukraine's agriculture and transport infrastructure and equipment, by blocking its ports, Russia has endangered food security for millions of people across the world. This is now a fact. Russia has weaponized grain just like it is doing it with its natural gas. This war has threatened European security. By weaponizing gas and asserting energy coercion, Russia is also testing the European resolve and resilience as winter approaches. Albania welcomes the progress achieved in the talks last week in Istanbul with the mediation of Turkey and the United Nations to open up the Black Sea for Ukrainian exports of grain. This news brought a sense of relief for many in the world, as for the first time in 5 months of war, something positive was in sight. We wanted to believe, as we do, that diplomacy and dialogue are always better than war. Alas, it took less than 24 hours. Alas, it took less than 24 hours after the deal to see a cynical attack of the port of Odessa. The message that those missiles brought was clear. We're bound by nothing. We can strike anywhere, anytime. It is as difficult to blame those who say that promises from Russia, oral or written, are worthless. Ukraine has learned it the hard way. In 1994, Ukrainians gave up the world's third largest arsenal of nuclear weapons on Russia's promise to guarantee Ukraine's security. Documents were signed, but they turned out to be only papers. In 1914, and again this year, Russia invaded the same country. We hope nonetheless that the grain deal will go through and will be quickly implemented and in full for the sake of millions. Most of them are living in developing countries, who have seen what it is like when Russia enters your dining room, who are now unsure that they will have food on the table when they wake up the next day. Colleagues, Ukraine is the most serious stress test of the rules-based international order. It is the boiling point between tyranny and the free world, a struggle between strategic corruption and democracy, a battle between the right to choose and the might to impose. Its outcome will be paramount not only for Ukraine, but for all of us. I thank you.
I thank the representative of Albania for their statement, and I now give the floor to the representative of the United States.
Thank you, Mr. President, and thank you to Undersecretary General DiCarlo for your briefing today. I too want to take a moment to express my sincere appreciation to Ambassador Nassan, to Geraldine for her contributions to the Security Council. During the 1 year, a bit over that we have worked together, I've admired your steadfast approach, your commitment to finding a way forward for peace and security. So I wish you the best of luck in the future, and I look forward to seeing you in Washington. The UN Charter is this organization's most sacred document. It's more than a small blue booklet, and it is more than noble words on the page. It is a commitment. It is a commitment that we have all freely signed as members of these United Nations. It is the embodiment of our ideals. It is the most powerful tool we have in its opening words to save succeeding generations from the scourge of war. Today, we're here to discuss how one country, Russia, has effectively set the UN Charter on fire. Since Russia's full-scale invasion of Ukraine in February, the world has witnessed Russia's flagrant violations of international law and complete disregard for the UN Charter and the principles of peace, sovereignty, and the protection of civilians that it holds dear. The International Court of Justice has ordered Russia to immediately suspend its military operations. The UN General Assembly has adopted resolutions with overwhelming support from the international community that have condemned Russia's aggression, demanded an end to the invasion and the withdrawal of Russian troops, and suspended Russia from the Human Rights Council. Instead of following these demands and feeling ashamed by these clear condemnations, Russia has in fact publicly expanded its war aims. There should no longer be any doubt, as we warned early this year, that Russia intends to dismantle Ukraine as a geopolitical entity and dissolve it from the world map entirely. We're seeing growing signs that Russia is laying the groundwork to yet again attempt to annex more of Ukraine's territories. That includes the installation of illegitimate proxy officials in Russian-held areas with the goal of holding sham referenda or a decree to join Russia. Minister of Foreign Affairs Lavrov has even stated that this is Russia's war aim. Specifically, Russia is currently reviewing plans to attempt to annex the region of Kherson and Zaporizhia and all of the Donetsk and Luhansk oblasts. This is galling. The acquisition of territory by force is about as clear a violation of the UN Charter as you can get. And we cannot, we will not stand by and let it happen in silence. So yes, we welcome the progress made in Istanbul last week on the export of grain and food and commend the Secretary General and the government of Turkey for their efforts to facilitate this much needed progress. But we also saw Russia's true character a few hours later when it launched a missile attack on the port of Odessa. Bombing a port does not make it easier for grain to get out. Russia should allow grain and food to leave Odessa unharmed to feed a hungry world. These cruel acts should come as no surprise, as we have said many times. We assess that members of Russia's forces have committed horrific war crimes in Ukraine. Those who perpetrated and ordered those crimes must be held to account for their actions. For those countries which say that one country's security should not come at the expense of another's, what exactly do you call Russia's armed invasion? An armed invasion of its neighbor, disdaining attempts at a peaceful resolution by silencing its guns, withdrawing its forces and embracing diplomacy? For countries which call for all parties to embrace diplomacy without naming Russia, let us be clear. Russia's ongoing actions are the sole obstacle to a resolution to this crisis. The evidence of the scale of atrocities continue to mount. We've seen credible reports of the bombing of schools and hospitals. You heard Undersecretary General DeCarlo's comments today. The killing of aid workers and journalists, the targeting of civilians attempting to flee, the brutal execution-style murder of those going about their daily business in Bucha. And we've seen the violent abuse, the forced deportations of Ukrainian civilians through so-called filtration operations. To date, there is evidence Russia's forces have interrogated, detained, forcibly deported, and estimated hundreds of thousands of Ukrainian citizens, including children, tearing them from their homes and sending them to remote regions in the east. As of May, in one location within a Russian-controlled area of Ukraine, there were over 20,000 people in line for filtration. The process of filtration is slow, with some Ukrainians waiting up to 3 weeks to be processed. Given the long wait, reports indicate that filtration center employees and people waiting filtration were selling places in line. The United States has information that officials from Russia's presidential administration are overseeing and coordinating filtration operations. Russia is also using advanced technology to facilitate filtration processes, including for the purpose of collecting data on Ukrainians undergoing filtration. In 2021, officials within a Russian-controlled area of Ukraine formulated a draft list of over a dozen proposed locations for filtration operations, including reinforced police stations. Let me put this in plain terms. Russia is tearing families apart. It is sending children to remote regions away from their homes. It is forcibly replacing people's passports and attempting to impose its own identity over the national identity of Ukrainian citizens. And it is expanding this horrific operation in blatant disregard for the principles of national sovereignty. Despite the disinformation Russia peddles in this very chamber, no one believes Ukraine is doing any of this to itself. Every member here has borne witness to the atrocities, and we will not forget. Each and every atrocity deserves accountability. The awful consequences of this conflict, the millions of Ukrainians who've been forced to flee their homes into neighboring countries or other parts of Ukraine, the disruption to food and other essential supplies, the war crimes and atrocities against civilians, and the resulting trauma will only end when Russia ends this war. Until that fateful day, the rest of us have a duty. We have a duty to stand up, to say enough is enough, and to defend the charter that we have all pledged to support. Thank you, Mr. President.
I thank the representative of the United States for their statement, and I now give the floor to the representative of the United Arab Emirates.
Mr. President, at the outset, I would like to thank Ms. Rosemary DiCarlo for her informative briefing. I also welcome the participation of Ukraine in this meeting. More than 5 months into the war, UN figures reveal a staggering humanitarian crisis. Nearly 16 million people need assistance, and over 12 million have been forcibly displaced, including approximately 2/3 of Ukraine's children. As the battlefield expands, a growing number of people whose movement is limited due to age, illness, or disability are caught in the midst of the heaviest fighting. The war's devastating toll continues to be felt outside Ukraine as it exacerbates food shortages and commodity prices increases, threatening the lives and livelihoods of people around the world. Against this difficult backdrop, we would like to express 3 key points. First, the protection of civilians remains paramount. Recent fighting in urban areas risks homes, schools, and hospitals with damage and destruction. The last several weeks witnessed numerous examples of the destruction of civilian infrastructure, often with heavy reported civilian casualties. There are increasingly worrying reports that this trend will escalate. Parties must heed their obligations under international law, including international humanitarian law, and refrain from targeting civilians and civilian objects, and avoid placing military objectives in or near civilian areas. Second, the war's impact on global food security only adds to the urgency of confidence-building measures that could pave the path towards broader agreements. In this context, while we welcome the deal agreed in Istanbul on exports of grain, foodstuffs, and fertilizers, and praise the invaluable role of the UN Secretary General and the Republic of Turkey, we are disappointed that the Security Council could not unify behind an endorsement of the deal. Unfortunately, positive developments in this conflict have been exceedingly rare. Therefore, it is all the more critical that when progress does happen, this body finds a way to respond with a single voice. For its part, the UAE believes that the agreement is a step in the right direction, but the measure of its success will be its full implementation and its utilization for further constructive international engagement, including by the UN. Third, this crisis has put this institution and its charter under strain. While the prospects of meaningful Security Council action on Ukraine appear limited, it remains crucial that we defend the principles of the charter and seize every opportunity to bring about a peaceful resolution. It is also critical that we recognize that upholding the UN Charter means ensuring that the Council continues its work to fulfill its primary responsibility for the maintenance of international peace and security in Ukraine and on every file on its agenda. Mr. President, as we have said before, only an end to the war will put a stop to the devastation it has wrought. This means a negotiated resolution that produces a sustainable peace. And as we have frequently said, achieving that requires women's full, equal, and meaningful participation in all peace efforts. It is essential that women's leadership and involvement not only take place at the end of the conflict, but also in the design and implementation of conflict resolution processes. As the fighting unfortunately continues, the parties and the international community must work to limit the suffering inflicted in Ukraine and the ramifications beyond. Still, we know that important progress can be made through dedicated and pragmatic diplomacy. It is vital that we encourage, nurture, and facilitate dialogue and de-escalation when and wherever possible. Thank you, Mr. President.
I thank the representative of the United Arab Emirates for their statement. And I now give the floor to the representative of France.
Monsieur le Président,
President,
d'abord je tiens à remercier l'ambassadrice d'Irlande pour sa contribution aux travaux du Conseil
contribution
depuis
to the
le
work
début
of
de
the
l'année
Council
dernière et lui
since the beginning
souhaiter
of last
tout
year.
ce qu'on peut lui souhaiter pour sa
I
prochaine
wish her
mission,
the very best
très
indeed
amicalement et très chaleureusement.
for her upcoming mission on a very
Nous entrons
friendly
dans le
and
6e
heartfelt
mois
basis.
du
We
conflit.
are entering the sixth
La Russie
month of the
poursuit
conflict.
sa guerre
Russia continues
injustifiable
its unjustifiable and
dévastatrice.
devastating war.
Elle concentre ses efforts sur
It
l'est
is
de
focusing
l'Ukraine
its efforts on
et elle
eastern
soumet des villes
Ukraine.
comme Poltava,
It is
Kremenchuk,
subjecting cities
Bakhmut
like Poltava,
à des pilonnages d'artillerie
Kremenchuk, or
indiscriminés.
Bakhmut to
Les attaques contre les
indiscriminate,
écoles et les
intense
hôpitaux se
shelling.
poursuivent.
Attacks
Le
against schools
conflit
and
a déjà
hospitals
tué
continue.
près de 350 enfants
The conflict
et on a
has
blessé
already
560
killed
autres.
almost 350 children
La Russie
and
est
injured
responsable de ces
560
ravages.
more. Russia
Elle a
is
prémédité son
responsible
agression
for
contre un État
devastation.
souverain
It
en violation
premeditated
flagrante
aggression
de la Charte des
against the
Nations Unies.
sovereign state in
Comme l'a
flagrant
exigé
violation of the Charter
la
of the
Cour
United
internationale de
Nations,
justice dans
as
son
demanded by
ordonnance
the
du 16
International
mars
Court of
dernier.
Justice in its order
La
of March
Russie est
16th.
juridiquement tenue de suspendre immédiatement ses opérations.
Russia is legally bound
En
to
agressant
immediately
l'Ukraine,
suspend its operations.
La Russie n'ébranle pas seulement la sécurité de
By
l'Europe,
attacking Ukraine,
elle remet
Russia
en cause
not
les
only
principes
weakens Europe's
fondamentaux
security,
du droit
it
international.
is attacking the very principles
La
of
France
international
dénonce
law.
la russification à marche forcée des zones occupées par l'armée russe.
France denounces
La
the
substitution de noms
intense
russes à des
Russification
noms ukrainiens de villes et de
in
quartiers.
areas occupied by the Russian
La
army.
délivrance de la nationalité russe aux
Substituting
nouveau-nés.
Russian names for
La
Ukrainian
mise en
names in
circulation
cities
du
and
rouble et la
neighborhoods.
modification des programmes scolaires
Issuing
constituent
Russian
autant
nationality to
de signaux
newborns,
clairs
circulating the
intentions de la
ruble and
Russie.
changing the
La
school
France
programs are
ne
all
reconnaîtra
clear
jamais
signals of Russia's
le
intentions.
contrôle ou l'annexion
France
du
will
territoire
never
ukrainien
recognize
par
the
la Russie.
control or the annexation
Monsieur
of
le
Ukrainian
Président,
territories
cette
by
guerre
Russia.
d'agression fait courir le risque d'une crise alimentaire
This
mondiale
war
sans
of
précédent.
aggression creates a
La
risk
Russie
of
est
an
seule
unprecedented world
responsable
food
de
crisis.
l'aggravation
Russia
de la
alone
situation
is responsible
alimentaire
for the
mondiale.
deterioration of the world
Dans
food
ce contexte,
situation. In
les
this
progrès
context,
accomplis à
the
Istanbul le
progress
22
made in
juillet
Istanbul
dernier
last
sont une
July
première étape.
22nd
La
are a
France
first
remercie
step.
le secrétaire général des Nations
France
Unies
thanks the
et la
Secretary
Turquie
General of the United
pour leur
Nations
rôle
and Turkey
clé dans ces
for their
négociations.
key role in these
Les
negotiations.
engagements qui ont été pris
The
doivent
commitments
être
made
tenus et mis en
must
œuvre
be
sans
fully
délai.
met
Ce
and
dont le monde a
implemented
besoin
with
maintenant,
no further delay.
c'est que les navires
What the
circulent en
world
mer Noire
needs now
et que
is
les
for ships
céréales
to sail on
parviennent
the
à
Black
ceux
Sea
qui en ont besoin.
and for grain to reach those who
Or,
need it.
L'encre avait à peine séché sur
And
ces accords
yet,
que la
the
Russie
ink
lançait
had
une
barely
attaque sur le
dried
port
on these
d'Odessa,
agreements when Russia
suivie
attacked
quelques jours plus
the
tard par de
port of
nouvelles frappes
Odessa,
sur Mykolaïev.
followed a few days later by new
Prétendre
strikes on
que ces
Mykolaiv,
bombardements ne fragilisent pas le
saying
lancement
that
effectif
these
du
bombings,
mécanisme agréé à
that
Istanbul
this shelling does not
est un
weaken
mensonge de
the
plus.
effective launch of the mechanism
Monsieur
agreed
le Président,
upon in
la
Istanbul
position
is a
française
lie.
est très claire.
Mr.
Il est
President,
nécessaire
the French
de
position is very
continuer
clear.
à soutenir l'Ukraine par
We
tous les
must
moyens,
continue to support
soient
Ukraine
militaires,
by all means
humanitaires
possible, military,
financiers.
humanitarian, or
La
financial.
France consacre 2 milliards de dollars
France
au soutien
provides $2
économique et
billion
humanitaire
for
de l'Ukraine.
economic
Elle
and
salue
humanitarian
la
support of
tenue de la
Ukraine.
conférence de
We
Lugano sur
hail
la reconstruction.
the holding
Elle
of
est
the
prête
Lugano
à
Conference
inscrire
on the
ce
reconstruction
soutien
of
dans le
Ukraine,
long terme.
and we stand ready
La
to
France reste
provide support over
résolument
the long term.
engagée pour
France
appuyer
is
les efforts
resolutely
des autorités
committed
ukrainiennes et des
to
juridictions
support the
internationales afin que
efforts
les
of
responsables
Ukrainian
des
authorities
exactions
and
massives
international
soient traduits en
jurisdiction to
justice.
hold accountable
À
and
ce
bring to
titre, elle a
justice
fourni une assistance
those responsible
technique
for mass
à la Procurature
atrocities
générale
in
d'Ukraine
Ukraine.
et elle soutient
We have
activement
provided
les
technical
activités de la Cour
assistance
pénale
to
internationale. La
Ukraine's
France
Office
appelle
of
une
the
nouvelle
Prosecutor
fois la
General and
Russie
actively
à la
support the
cessation
work of the
immédiate
International
des
Criminal Court.
hostilités,
We
au
call
retrait
for
de
the
ses troupes du
immediate
territoire ukrainien
stop of
et au plein
hostilities,
respect du droit international
for Russia
humanitaire
to
et du droit
withdraw
international des
troops
droits de
from
l'homme.
Ukrainian
Elle continuera
territory
de se
and to
tenir aux
fully
côtés de la
respect
nation
international
souveraine
humanitarian and
ukrainienne dans
international
son
human
action de
rights law.
légitime défense
France continues to
courageuse
stand
et
with the
acharnée.
sovereign
Je
nation
vous
of
remercie.
Ukraine as it acts in courageous and determined
thank the
legitimate
representative of
self-defense.
France.
Thank you.
For their statement. And I now give the floor to the representative of China.
谢谢主席。
Thank you, Mr. President.
首先，像其他代表一
First
样
of，all, like
我
other
要
delegates,
向爱
I
尔
would
兰
also
常驻代
like
表
to
佩森大使的离去，向他对他表示告别，感谢他对安理会
bid
工
my
作的贡
farewell
献。
to the ambassador
也祝他
of
在新的
Ireland,
工作
and I
岗位
thank
上
her for
一
her
切顺利。
contribution. I wish her all the best in her new post.
主席先生，乌克兰危机
Mr.
自
President,
爆
the
发至今
Ukraine
已经
crisis
延
has
到
been dragging
5个
on
多
for
月，
more than 5 months
不仅
now.
给欧洲地
This
区带来
crisis
严
has
重
not
冲
only
击，
had a serious
负
impact
面的
on
外溢
Europe,
效应
its negative
也已
spillover
波及
effect
全
is
球。
also reverberating
受
globally.
战争和制裁影响，
Affected by wars and
乌克兰、
sanctions,
俄罗斯的
the
粮食化肥出
impediment
口
to
受到阻
food
碍
and，fertilizer exports
不仅
from
对全球
Ukraine
粮
and
食安
Russia
全
is
构
not
成
only
挑战，
posing a challenge to
加剧
global
脆
food
弱发展中
security,
国家困境，
aggravating the plight of
也给
vulnerable
国际社
developing
会实
countries,
现
but also
2030
making
年
it
可
more
持续发展
difficult
议
for the
程，
international
推
community
动世界
to
经济
achieve
企
the
稳复苏，
2030
带来
agenda
更多
and
困
to
难。
promote a stable recovery of the
我们
world
高兴地
economy.
看到，
We're
在
pleased
有
to
关各方
see
的共
that
同努
last
力
week
下，
in Istanbul, with the
上周
joint
在伊
efforts
斯
of
坦
the
布尔，
relevant parties concerned,
俄罗斯、乌克
Russia,
兰、土耳其
Ukraine,
联合国
Turkey, and the United
签署了
Nations
乌克兰
signed
粮
an
食外溢
agreement
协
on
议。
shipping grain out of
俄罗斯
Ukraine,
和联合国
and
签署
that
了俄罗
Russia
斯
and the
粮食
United
化肥
Nations
出口
signed
协
an
议。
agreement on the export of Russian food and
目前，
fertilizers.
四方共同参与
Currently,
的
a
联合协
joint
调中心
coordination
已经成
center
立，
with the participation of the
首
four
批
parties
运
has
粮
been
船离乌的
established,
准
and
备
the
工作
preparation is
正稳步推进。
progressing smoothly for the first
这
shipment
为
of
缓
grain
解发
out
展
of
中国家的
Ukraine.
粮食短
This
缺，
brings hope for
缓
easing
解
the food
贫困人
shortage
群的
and the
苦难，
suffering of the poor
缓解
in developing
全球粮食
countries,
危
and
机
for
带来
alleviating
了
the
希望。
global food crisis.
中方对此表示
China
欢迎，
welcomes this.
对古特雷斯秘书长
China
和有关各
commends
方发挥的
Secretary
积极
General
作用。
Guterres and all parties concerned for the positive role
两
they
个协议
played.
的签署表
The
明，
signing of the two
只要做
agreements
出不
shows
懈努
that
力，
as long as we
当
do
事
not
方
relent
仍
our
有
efforts,
通过
there's
协
still
商
room for the
解决
parties
问
to
题的可
resolve
能。
problems through
我们
consultation.
对俄罗斯、
We're
乌克兰
encouraged by
超
the
越政
effort
治
of
分歧，
Russia and Ukraine
开展
in
建设性接触
transcending their political
感到鼓舞。
differences for
也
constructive
希望双
engagement.
方
We also
继
hope
续
that the two
保持
parties
对
will
话沟
continue to
通，
maintain dialogue
争
and
取早日
communication and
重
strive
返
for
外
an
交谈
early
判，
return to
尽快
diplomatic
实现
negotiations
停
and
火止
achieve
战。
ceasefire as soon as possible.
粮食外运问题十
The
分复
issue
杂，
of grain shipping is
协议
very
在执行过
complex.
程中难
It
免
is
遇到这
quite
样那样的
common to
困难。
encounter difficulties difficulties of one kind
有
or
关各
another
方
in
要
the
坚
course
守
of
政治
implementing
意
the
愿，
agreement. The
秉
parties
持合
concerned
作
should
精
adhere
神，
to the
加强
political
沟通
will,
协调，
uphold the spirit of
妥
cooperation,
善应对
strengthen
挑战，
communication and
共
coordination,
同推动
and
协议
properly
执行
address the
基好部
challenges so
开
that
好
they can
局，
jointly promote the
并持之以
implementation of
恒
the agreement
推进
and
下
get
去。
it off to a good start, push it forward continuously.
国际社会
The
要从人道
international
主义角
community
度
should see
看
the
待两个协
signing
议
and
的签
implementation
署
of
和
the
执
two
行，
agreements from the
摒弃
humanitarian
政治化
perspective,
的做法，
reject
努力为
politicization,
协议的后
create
续
a
落实
favorable
营
environment
造
for the
良好的环
follow-up
境，
implementation
提
of the
供
agreement,
坚实的保
and
障。
provide solid guarantees.
主席先生，
Mr. President,
今年2月乌克兰危机
since
爆
the
发以来，
outbreak of the
中
Ukraine
方始
crisis
终
last
本着客
February,
观、
China
公
has
正
been
态度，
taking an objective and
从乌克兰问题
impartial
的历史
approach
经纬
and
和是
proceeding
非
from
曲
the
直出发，
historical development and the
站
merit
在
of the
和平一
issue
边，
itself.
站在
China has
人
been
道一
standing
边，
on the side of peace
呼吁停
and on
火
the
止
side
战，
of humanitarian
推动
efforts,
局势
calling
降
for a
温，
ceasefire to stop
积极
fighting,
劝和促谈，
facilitating a
施
cool-off,
以人
actively
道援
promoting
手。
peace talks, and providing
中
humanitarian
方先后提
assistance.
出缓解乌克
China
兰
has
人道危机
successfully
的
put
6
forward
点
a
倡议
six-point
和
initiative
国际
and the
粮食安全
International
合
Food
作倡议，
Security Cooperation
已
Initiative
向乌克兰提
to
供
ease
2
the
批
humanitarian
共
crisis
1500
in
万元人
Ukraine.
民币人
China
道
has
主义援
provided
助，
2 batches of humanitarian assistance
近期
totaling
还将追
15
加
million yuan
2000
to
万元人
Ukraine,
民币
with
紧
an
急人
additional
道主义
20
物
million
资
yuan
援助。
in emergency humanitarian
我们
aid to
以
be
负责任的
provided in the
方式
near
为
future.
降低危
We
机的外溢
made
影
our
响，
efforts in a
缓
responsible
解危
way
机对全
to
球产业
mitigate the
链、供应
spillover
链的
effect of the
冲击做
crisis
出
and
努
will
力，
continue to play an active
并将继
constructive
续
role in
为稳定
stabilizing
国际贸易
international
和世界
trade
经济
and the
秩序
world
发
economic
挥
order.
积极和建设性的作用。主席先生，
Mr. President,
中方在乌克兰问题上的立
China's
场是一
position
贯
on
的、
the Ukraine
明
issue
确的，
is
也是
consistent
经得
and
起
clear
历史考
and
验
will stand the test of history.
我们始终主
We
张，
have always maintained
各国的
that
主
the
权、领
sovereignty
土
and
完整
territorial
都应
integrity
该
of
得
all
到尊
countries
重，
should be respected.
各国
The
的合理安
legitimate
全关
security
切
concerns of
都
all
应该得
countries
到
be
重视。
taken seriously,
联合国宪章的
and the
各项
purposes
宗
and
旨和原
principles
则
of the UN
都应
Charter
该
be
得到遵守。
abided by.
一切有利于
All
和平解
efforts
决危机的
conducive
努
to the
力
peaceful settlement
都
of the
应该得到
crisis
支持。
should be supported.
我们近期已经在
We
安理会
have
内多次
stated
阐明
China's
中方立
position
场。
many times in the Council
今天在这里，
recently,
我想
and
强
I
调
would
3
like to
点。
emphasize 3 points today.
第一，乌
First,
克兰危机
the
表明，
Ukraine crisis
各国安
shows
全不可
that
分
the
割，
security of all
只有
countries
重视
is
别人的安全，
inseparable. Only
维
by
护大
attaching
家的安
importance
全，
to the security
才
of
能真
others
正实
and
现自己
safeguarding
的
the
安全。
security of everyone can
各
our
国要
own
秉
security
持
be
共
truly
同、
realized.
综合、
All
合
countries
作、
should uphold
可
a
持续的安
common,
全观，
comprehensive, cooperative, and
重
sustainable
视彼
security
此合
concept,
理安全关系，
attach importance to each
构
other's
建均
legitimate
衡、
security
有效、
concerns,
可持续
build
的
a balanced,
全球
effective, and
和地区
sustainable
安全
global
框
and
架，
regional security
共同
architecture,
维护
and
世
jointly
界和平，
safeguard world peace.
将本国安
Putting
全
one's
凌驾
own
于别国
security
安全之上，
above that of others,
图谋强化
attempting
军事
to
集团，
strengthen military
建立绝对
blocs,
优势，
establishing absolute
甚至按照自己的
superiority,
标准
and even shaping
去
the
塑造
surrounding
别国的
environment of other
周边
countries
环境，
according to their own
只会
standards
引发
will
冲突
only
对抗，
lead to
分
conflict
裂
and
国际社会，
confrontation, dividing 只
也
the
会
national
让自己
community, and
更不安
make
全。
themselves less secure.
第二，
Second,
乌克兰危机
the
表
Ukraine
明，
crisis shows
百年未有
that the
之大变局
evolution of the changes
正加速
unseen in
演
the
进。
world in a century
在
is
战争和疫情
accelerating,
交织冲击
and
下，
our world is
我们这
facing
个
more
世界
and
面
more
临越来越多
instability
的
and
不确定性和
uncertainty
不稳
under
定
the
性。
intertwined impact of wars and
在
pandemics.
充满变化
In
和
an
挑战
era
的时
of
代，
change and
没有哪
challenges,
个国家能
no
够
country
独自
can
应
deal
对，
with it alone,
也没有哪个
and
国
no
家能
country
够
is
独善其身。
insulated.
在国际社会
At a
最需要
time
团结
when
合
the
作、
international community
共克时
is
艰
in
的时候，
dire need of unity and
固守冷
cooperation
战
to
思维和集
overcome
团政治，
difficulties together,
推行
it's
脱钩锻
extremely
炼和小院
irresponsible
高
and
墙，
dangerous to cling
把
to
经
the
贸往来
Cold War
政治化、
mentality and
工
bloc
具化、武器
politics,
化，
promote decoupling
胁
and
迫其他
small
国
yard
家
and
选边
hyphens
站队，
to
刻
politicize,
意制造分裂和
instrumentalize,
对
and
抗，
weaponize economic and trade
是极不负
exchanges,
责任
to
和极
coerce
其
other
危险的
countries
举动。
to take sides and to deliberately
国际社
create
会对
division
当
and
前这股逆
confrontation.
流要
The
高度
international
警惕，
community should be
共同
highly
抵制。
alert to this countercurrent and resist it
我们绝不能
together.
让乌克兰
We
危
must
机
not let
拉
the
开
crisis
新冷
of
战的序幕，
Ukraine kick off a new Cold
绝不
War.
能
We
重
must
蹈
not
历史覆
repeat
辙，
the mistakes of
绝不
history.
能让
We
人类
must
社
not
会
let
再次经
humanity
历
experience
惨不
once
堪言
again
之战火。
the unbearable scourge of war.
第三，
Third,
乌克兰危
the
机表明，
crisis in
只有
Ukraine
恪守联
shows
合国
that
宪章
only
的
by
宗旨和
adhering to the purposes and principles of the UN Charter can we enjoy peace and development, and any deviation from this will only bring conflict and anxiety. As the legal cornerstone of today's international order, the international Charter is irreplaceable in its role and unshakable in its status. Compliance with the purposes and principles of the UN Charter should be consistent with words matching with deeds instead of saying one thing but doing another, not to mention double standards or selective application. While some country has repeatedly emphasized the principle of sovereignty over the issue of Ukraine, it has incessantly challenged the sovereignty of China over Taiwan and even deliberately deliberately created tension in the Taiwan Strait. This is a disregard and infringement of the principles and purposes of the UN Charter. China has always respected the sovereignty of other countries and certainly hopes that its own sovereignty be respected by other countries. China is resolute and firm as rock in its will to safeguard national sovereignty. No one should underestimate the determination and ability of more than 1.4 billion Chinese people to defend its national sovereignty and territorial integrity. I hope the country concerned will see this clearly and not play with fire. I thank you, Mr. President.
I thank the representative of China for their statement, and I now give the floor to the representative of Ghana.
Mr. President, let me begin by joining you in expressing appreciation to our colleague, Ambassador Geraldine Nelson, for her impactful work in the Council, including on UNOWAS, which we worked on together, and to wish you the very best in your next endeavors. I also thank USG Rosemary DiCarlo for the timely updates on the security and humanitarian situation in Ukraine, and warmly welcome to this meeting all Rule 37 and Rule 39 participants. Ghana deeply regrets the unrelenting hostilities several months into the start of this needless conflict, in spite of the mounting civilian death toll and the extensive destruction caused to economic infrastructure, cultural sites, monuments, and livelihoods. We also continue to worry deeply about the expanding humanitarian threat as more civilians, particularly children, women, the aged, and persons with disability, come under the barrage of crossfires and are forced to flee their homes or to shelter in bunkers with limited access to food, clean water, and basic services. As we have forcefully stated previously, infrastructure and livelihoods could potentially be rebuilt after the war, but the tragic reality of human lives lost to this senseless conflict cannot be recovered. It is for this reason that we wish to use this opportunity to renew our call on the Russian Federation to stop this war and to heed the international community's call to unconditionally withdraw all of its troops from the internationally recognized borders of Ukraine. In making this genuine call on the Russian Federation, we are mindful of and acknowledge the stated security concerns which we believe could be effectively addressed by Pacific settlement, as provided for by the Charter of the United Nations, through intense diplomacy, underpinned by unconditional dialogue and a commitment to cooperation. The solution required is certainly not a military one, but a political settlement that takes into account the security concerns of the parties and assures the stability of the entire region. Mr. President, we are concerned by the persistent inability of this Council to support the parties to engage in substantial discussions about urgent ceasefire and peace initiatives, despite the Charter obligation on the Council to shoulder the primary responsibility for maintaining international peace and security. The current situation affects the reputation of the Council and undermines its credibility as an effective arbiter in other conflict theaters. In the light of the Council's handicap, Ghana encourages and affirms its steadfast support to the continued deployment of the good offices of the Secretary General in the international endeavor to bring an end to the war and facilitate a diplomatic solution to the crisis in Ukraine. Ghana commends the Secretary General and other leaders, especially those of Turkey, for the positive engagement of the parties to the Ukrainian conflict, culminating in the landmark agreement on the initiative on the safe transportation of grain and foodstuffs from Ukrainian ports signed in Istanbul on 22 July 2022. We also welcome the Memorandum of Understanding between the Russian Federation and the United Nations Secretariat on promoting the access of Russian food products and fertilizers to world markets. Ghana takes note of the official inauguration of the Joint Coordination Center in Istanbul and remains confident of the prospect of a swift and effective implementation of the agreements in order for commercial operations to resume in the Black Sea and contribute substantially in helping to stabilize international prices of food and fertilizers, which are currently priced beyond the capacity of many consumers and users. Mr. President, these are difficult times for Ukraine, and we are pained by the traumatic circumstances that the people of Ukraine have been forced into by the war. The mental impact, especially on children, is likely to have devastating consequences for several years to come. In this connection, humanitarian efforts should not only focus on the physical needs of the affected civilians, but also on their psychological needs and emotional health, as the damage of the war will result in long-lasting psychological trauma. In conclusion, I would like to remind all actors, including the parties to the conflict, that the protection and safety of civilians should drive our efforts to facilitate a peaceful settlement of the conflict. As a Council, we have an urgent and collective responsibility to invest in the peace of Ukraine and avoid actions that reinforce security apprehensions of the parties or only serves to perpetuate a needless war. I thank you.
I thank the representative of Ghana for the statement, and then I'll give the floor to the representative of India.
Thank you, Mr. President. I also join others in extending our best wishes to Permanent Representative of Ireland, Ambassador Geraldine Bryan Nason, in her future endeavors. I thank USG Rosemary DiCarlo for briefing on the situation in Ukraine. India continues to remain concerned over the situation in Ukraine. The conflict has resulted in loss of lives and countless miseries for its peoples, particularly for women, children, and elderly, with millions becoming homeless and forced to take shelter in neighboring countries. Reports of deaths of civilians in the ongoing conflict are deeply disturbing. We reiterate our grave concerns in this regard. Since the beginning of the conflict in Ukraine, India has consistently called for immediate cessation of hostilities and an end to the violence. India has called upon both sides to return to the path of diplomacy and dialogue, and has also expressed its support for all diplomatic efforts to end the conflict. We believe that no solution can be arrived at the cost of innocent lives. Our Prime Minister has spoken to the presidents of Ukraine and Russia on multiple occasions and reiterated India's position. Mr. President, the impact of the Ukraine conflict is not just limited to Europe. The conflict is exacerbating concerns over food, fertilizer, and fuel security, particularly in the developing countries. It is necessary for all of us to adequately appreciate the importance of equity, affordability, and accessibility when it comes to food grains. Open markets must not become an argument to perpetuate inequity and promote discrimination. In this context, Mr. President, we welcome the recent development towards ensuring the safe and secure export of grains and fertilizers. We hope these agreed measures will be implemented by all parties earnestly. We believe these measures alone may not be sufficient to address the food insecurity concerns. India is committed to working constructively in mitigating the adverse impact of conflict on food security. India has been providing financial assistance as well as supplying food grains to countries to meet their food security needs and based on the request of their governments. India has exported more than 1.8 million tons of wheat to countries in need, including Afghanistan, Myanmar, Sudan, and Yemen in the last 3 months. UN OCHA has also acknowledged that export of wheat from India has emerged as a key supply line for Yemen in the wake of Ukraine conflict. We are continuing to help our neighbor Sri Lanka to ensure their food security. We are also trying to increase the production of fertilizers in India. There is a need to focus on the availability of fertilizers and keep the supply chains of fertilizers smooth at a global scale. Similarly, effort should be made to ensure stability in the global supply of fuel commensurate with the demand. We reiterate the importance of UN guiding principles of humanitarian assistance. Humanitarian action must always be guided by principles of humanitarian assistance, that is, humanity, neutrality, impartiality, and independence. These measures should never be politicized. Mr. President, we continue to reiterate that the global order is anchored on international law, UN Charter, and respect for territorial integrity and sovereignty of states. I thank you.
I thank the representative of India for their statement, and I now give the floor to the representative of Norway.
Thank you, President, and let me also, on behalf of the Norwegian delegation, join others in thanking Ambassador Geraldine Nason for excellent companionship, both in the running for and in the Security Council over the past years. President, I would like to thank USG DiCarlo for her updates on the ongoing Russian invasion of Ukraine, and in particular its impact on the lives of the Ukrainian people. The UN Charter prohibits aggression and acquisition of territory by force. As this war on Ukraine continues, it inflicts a terrible cumulative harm on the civilian population, undermining prospects for peace and security. More than 5 months of Russian invasion and violence has created wounds that will take generations to heal. Russian attacks against civilians and civilian infrastructure have continued to intensify in many areas across Ukraine. Recent attacks in Chasiv Yar, Kharkiv, Kramatorsk, and Vinnytsia have left scores of civilians injured or killed, and people all over Ukraine, including in Kiev, continue to live in daily fear for the next attack. We reiterate our demand that civilians must be protected and international humanitarian law and international human rights law fully respected and implemented. President, the Russian aggressors' disregard for human rights continues to shock international community. We are deeply concerned by reports that Russian forces have tortured prisoners of war and unlawfully detained, tortured, and forcibly disappeared civilians in occupied territories. There are ample indications of war crimes being committed. These crimes cannot be forgotten. Perpetrators at all levels must be held accountable. President, we have seen some hope amongst the bleak outlook. Norway commends the Secretary General for his contribution to the essential initiative of the safe transportation of grain and foodstuffs from Ukrainian ports, along with the Republic of Turkey for facilitating the negotiations and subsequent signing ceremony on the 22nd of July. This initiative will be essential to ease global food insecurity and build trust between the parties, but it must be implemented. The entire world was shocked by the Russian missile attack against the Ukrainian port of Odessa the very next day after signing the initiative. Norway stands together with Ukraine and echoes the clear condemnation by the Secretary General of Russia's attacks against Odessa. President, the war in Ukraine is a human crisis purposefully created by Russian leaders. They bear the responsibility to end this war. They must end this suffering, both for the Ukrainian people and for all people around the world impacted by the consequences of Russia's actions. We demand an immediate cessation of hostilities by the Russian Federation against Ukraine and the full and immediate withdrawal of the Russian forces and military equipment from Ukraine's internationally recognized borders and territorial waters. And we support all sincere efforts towards political dialogue, negotiation, and mediation. President, in May, this Council expressed a unified support for the efforts of the Secretary General in the search for a peaceful solution. These efforts are more important than ever, as the accumulated effects of the war are felt by the people of Ukraine and beyond. We therefore encourage the Secretary General to continue his efforts to support dialogue between the parties in the search for a peaceful solution and peace for the people of Ukraine. Thank you.
I thank the representative of Norway for their statement, and I now give the floor to the representative of Mexico.
Muchas gracias, presidente.
Thank you very much,
Empiezo
President.
por desearle
Let me begin by
a
wishing
nuestra amiga,
our
la
friend,
embajadora de Irlanda,
the ambassador
el
of
mayor de
Ireland,
los éxitos en su
the
nueva
greatest
responsabilidad en
success in her
Washington.
new
Ha
responsibilities
sido
in
un
Washington.
gusto trabajar con
It
usted,
has been a
señora
pleasure to
embajadora.
work with you, Madam Ambassador.
Agradezco a la subsecretaria
I
Di
thank
Carlo por
Undersecretary
su
Di Carlo for her
presentación
briefing.
y damos la bienvenida a
We
todos los
welcome
países que
all the
participan en
countries
esta sesión
participating
bajo las reglas
at this meeting
37 y
under
39.
Rules 37 and
Desde hace
39
poco
of the
más de
Council.
5 meses, hemos escuchado diversas
Over a little more
interpretaciones
than 5
en el
months, we have
contexto de
heard
una
various
narrativa
interpretations
confusa
as part
que
of a
no
confused
justifica la
narrative
guerra en
that,
Ucrania.
that does not
La posición
justify
de
the
mi
war in
país ha sido
Ukraine.
muy clara desde el inicio en apego al
The position
artículo
of my country,
2.4 de la
Mexico,
Carta
has
de la
been very
ONU,
clear since the
que a la
beginning
letra dice
in
los
adherence to
miembros se
Article
abstendrán de
2.4 of the
recurrir
Charter
a
of
la
the United
amenaza o al
Nations,
uso de la
which
fuerza
says, and I
contra la
quote,
integridad
all members
territorial
shall
o la
refrain
independencia
from the
política
threat
de
or use of
cualquier
force
Estado.
against the territorial
Lo que
integrity
ocurre en
or
Ucrania
political
es una
independence of
violación
any state, end
flagrante
quote.
a la Carta.
What is happening in Ukraine
Son
is a
asimismo
flagrant
muy
violation of the
preocupantes
Charter.
las interpretaciones
Also
laxas
very
y
concerning
manipuladas
are the
del
loose
derecho a la
and
legítima
manipulated
defensa
interpretations
contenido en el
of the
artículo
right to
51 de
legitimate
la propia
self-defense
Carta,
contained
que
in
sientan un
Article 51
peligroso
of the Charter
precedente.
itself,
Es un
which
asunto
establish a
que mi país ha
dangerous
denunciado
precedent.
sistemáticamente en
This is
diversos
something
contextos
that my
desde
country
hace
has
ya muchos años.
systematically denounced in many
Además de
contexts
la clara
over
afrenta a la
long
Carta de la
years.
ONU y a los
Besides the
principios
glaring affront
constitucionales
to
de la
the Charter
política
of the
exterior de
United
mi país,
Nations
han
and to
ocurrido
Mexico's
violaciones
constitutional
recurrentes al derecho
principles of foreign
internacional,
policy, there
incluidas
have
las
been
normas del
recurrent
derecho
violations
internacional
of
humanitario.
international law,
Los
including
ataques
standards of
contra zonas
international
comerciales
humanitarian law,
y residenciales
attacks against
continúan y el
commercial
saldo
and
para la
residential
población civil es
areas
deplorable.
continue. The
El
outcome
pasado
for the civilian
14 de
population
julio
is
se
deplorable.
registró en
Last
Venecia
July
un ataque
14th,
que dejó
there was an
más
attack
de
on
20
Venezia,
civiles muertos,
which left more than
incluidos
25
varios
civilians dead, including
Y este
several
fue
children.
precedido por el ataque del 9
This
de
was,
julio en Chassis Yar, en el que murieron otros
preceded
48
by the attack
civiles.
on
Y así
Chassis
suman ya
Yar
más de
on July
5,000
9, where
las
another
muertes civiles
48
que han sido
civilians were
verificadas.
killed.
Pero las cifras reales
Deplorably, there are
seguramente
already
son
several
mayores.
thousands of
Mientras
civilian
continúen las
deaths that have been
hostilidades,
verified, but the
la
real
prioridad debe
figures
ser la
are probably
protección de
much
civiles
larger.
y la ayuda
As
humanitaria.
long as hostilities
Las
continue,
partes
the
deben
priority
observar los
must be the
principios de
protection of
distinción y
civilians and humanitarian
proporcionalidad,
assistance. The
así como
parties
tomar
must
todas
observe
las
the
precauciones
principles of
necesarias
distinction
para
and
proteger tanto a
proportionality
la población
and take all of
como
the
a la
necessary
infraestructura
precautions
civil.
to protect both the
Algunas medidas
population and
específicas que
civilian
deben adoptarse de
infrastructure.
manera prioritaria
Some
son
priority
la
measures that must be
divulgación
taken
veraz
as
y
a
oportuna
priority are
de información
truthful
y de
and
alertas,
timely reporting of
la
information
retirada de la
and
población
alerts,
civil a lugares seguros,
withdrawing the civilian
la
population
construcción
to
de
safe
refugios,
places,
la
building
movilización y el
shelters,
acceso de las organizaciones de
mobilizing and
protección
ensuring
civil
access
y
for
el no
civilian
uso
protection
de armas con
organizations,
efectos
and not using
indiscriminados
weapons
en
with
áreas densamente pobladas,
indiscriminate effects
por
in
mencionar
densely
algunas.
populated areas,
El
to
llamado que
mention just a
reiteramos es
few.
inequívoco. Se debe respetar
We
el
are
derecho
making
internacional humanitario
repeated
sin
and
excepción.
unmistakable call.
La dimensión humanitaria de este conflicto
International
ha escalado
humanitarian
en
law
una
must be
proporción
respected
trágica y
with no
lamentable.
exception.
Se estima
The
que son ya
humanitarian
cerca de
dimension of this
16
conflict has
millones de
escalated
personas
to
con
tragic
necesidades
and pitiful
humanitarias de diversa índole,
proportions.
pero
It
muchas
is
de ellas
estimated that
son necesidades
already
muy
almost
críticas.
16 million people
Señor presidente,
have
el mundo ha
humanitarian
seguido
needs
con
of
gran
various
atención
kinds,
los
many
acuerdos
of them extremely
suscritos en
critical.
Estambul el
President,
pasado 22
the
de
world
junio.
has closely followed
México
the
reconoce
agreement
el
signed in
compromiso y
Istanbul
el
last
esfuerzo que ha
July
supuesto para
22.
ambas
Mexico
partes,
acknowledges the
para Rusia y
commitment and
para Ucrania,
efforts this is meant for
alcanzar
both
dichos
parties.
acuerdos, así
Russia
como la
and Ukraine
facilitación
have
diligente
made to reach these agreements, as well as the diligent facilitation of the government of Turkey. We praise the vision, the initiative, and the momentum that Secretary General Antonio Guterres provided, as well as the skillful work of his mediation team. Just as we welcomed the good offices of the Secretary General in the statement of May 6, today we express our acknowledgement and reiterate our support for the Secretary General to continue the delicate task of seeking new ways to make progress in pacifying the region. Moreover, it is deplorable that the Security Council was not able to welcome these agreements, the so-called Black Sea agreements, despite their great significance as the first concrete measures to respond to the global food crisis, which looms like a lethal threat over many regions of the planet, and which show that even in the midst of war, dialogue is still possible. It is also most deplorable that just a few hours after the agreement was signed, Odessa came under attack from missiles. But the agreements are in force and they have begun to be implemented. This is a very important progress, and its real value should not be underestimated. The safe passage of grain, fertilizer, and related products towards world markets is a lifesaver for millions of people depending on it, who live in food insecurity and who can fall into famine very easily. Though Istanbul has sent encouraging signals to all of us, the complete cessation of hostilities must be the true goal. The immediate future calls for openness, dialogue, and true commitment, both from the parties involved and from the international community, in order to put an end to this war. Mexico reiterates its conviction that the only path to achieve this is through diplomacy. This implies continuing with the work of mediation provided in the Charter of the United Nations itself. And for this reason, we call on the Secretary General and on his team to give continuity to the agreements reached. Thank you very much, President.
I thank the representative of Mexico for his statement, and I give the floor now to the representative of the United Kingdom.
Thank you, President. And I join others in thanking Ambassador Byrne-Nason for her stalwart and eloquent defence of international peace and security during your tenure on the Security Council and elsewhere. We will miss you. President, I'd like to start by thanking Under-Secretary General De Carlo for her briefing. First, we join others in welcoming the 22nd of July deal agreed in Istanbul to export the grain trapped by Russia's blockade of Odessa and other ports. We commend the role of the United Nations and Turkey in brokering this solution. The agreement is undoubtedly important. Its implementation is now vital, so that Ukrainian farmers' grain can once again be baked into bread in markets and on tables around the world, and enable the World Food Programme to address pressing famine conditions, including in Somalia and Ethiopia. Second, we cannot forget the record of Russia's atrocities and crimes in the over 5 months since Russia invaded Ukraine. Before the ink was even dry on the 22nd of July grain agreement, Russia brazenly attacked Odessa port. This latest attack follows others: breaches of international humanitarian law in Bucha and Irpin, the attacks on civilians in the Mariupol theatre, Kramatorsk train station, Kremenchuk shopping mall, apartment buildings in Chasiv Yar and Vinnytsia, and the widespread torture and abuse of detainees, including women and children, as identified by Human Rights Watch and the OSCE Moscow mechanism. The video this week of the castration of a Ukrainian prisoner of war by Russian soldiers is an illustration of Russia's barbarism and criminality. Third, President, Russia has violated the UN Charter and breached its obligations under that charter. For 5 months, Russia has been engaged in an illegal invasion of another member state, in breach of its charter obligations, and in complete disregard of resolutions of the General Assembly and the orders of the ICJ. Preparations for sham referenda in Kherson and Zaporizhia are the latest examples of Russia's breaches of Ukrainian sovereignty and territorial integrity. So, Mr. President, we continue to demand that Russia end its invasion, withdraw from Ukraine, and uphold its obligations under the UN Charter. I thank you.
I thank the representative of the United Kingdom for her statement, and I give the floor now to the representative of the Russian Federation.
Спасибо, господин председатель.
Thank you, Mr. President.
За прошедший с момента предыдущего
Since
заседания
the
Совета
previous Security
Безопасности по
Council
Украине
meeting
месяц,
on Ukraine a month
нам
ago,
удалось значительно
we have
продвинуться в
managed to make
реализации задач,
significant progress in achieving the
ставящихся в ходе
objectives
специальной военной операции.
set for the special military operation.
Со взятием
With the
Северодонецка и
taking of
Лисичанска,
Severodonetsk and
российские
Lysychansk,
вооруженные силы
Russian armed
формирования
forces
народных
and the
республик
formations of the
полностью
People's
освободили
Republics have fully
территорию ОНУ.
liberated the territory of the LPR.
Продолжается полномерное наступление
The
в
steady
ДНР.
movement into DPR is
Всего в
continuing.
республиках
In
освобождено
total,
уже
within the
255
republics,
населенных пунктов.
255
Лишь вопрос
towns and
времени,
villages have
когда
been
вся их
liberated, and it's
территория
only a matter
вернется
of
под
time
контроль
before their
населения
full
Донбасса.
territory returns to the control of the population of Donbass.
Всемирную сеть
The
заполнили
internet has been
видеоролики о том,
filled with video
как в
clips
освобожденном
of how
Лисичанске
in
жители
liberated
выходили на улицы
Lysychansk,
и встречали
the people
российских
living there
военных
came out onto
и
the
силы
streets and
народной
met
милиции
Russian forces and
с
the forces of
георгиевскими
the People's
ленточками в
Militia
руках с
with St.
российским
George's
флагом.
ribbons and with Russian
Предлагаю
flags.
всем, кому за это
I would
время
suggest that
изрядно
all
надоели
those who have grown
украинские
tired over all
пропагандистские
this time
сказки
of
про
Ukrainian
российскую
propaganda
армию,
fairy tales about the Russian
якобы
army that is
терроризирующую
allegedly
местное
terrorizing the
население.
local population,
Посмотреть эти
I would
видеокадры
suggest that you
с
look at
реакцией
these
живых
videos
людей,
showing the reactions of
с
real
их слезами
people,
радости, когда
their
они
tears
смогли
of joy
наконец
when they
выйти из
were at last
укрытий
able
и
to
больше не
leave
бояться
their shelters
украинских
and no longer
националистов.
needed to fear Ukrainian nationalists.
Полным ходом идет восстановление
The
освобождаемых
reconstruction of the
территорий.
liberated territories is proceeding
Благодаря
at
нашим
pace.
усилиям
Thanks
возвращается
to
к
our
мирной жизни
efforts,
Мариуполь, где
normal life
возобновлено
is returning
центральное
to Mariupol,
водоснабжение и
where central
восстанавливается
water
подача
supply has been
электроэнергии.
restored and electricity is being restored
В
as well.
ЛНР начаты работы
In
по строительству
LPR,
магистрального
work has begun on the
водопровода.
construction of a
А в
major
самом
water
Луганске
pipeline, and in Lugansk
многофункционального
itself, a
медицинского центра.
multifunctional medical center is being built.
Жестокость
The
украинских
cruelty of the
националистов,
Ukrainian
их безразличие к
nationalists,
жителям Юга
their
и Востока
indifference to those
Украины
living in the
очень
south and
сильно
east of
сказались
Ukraine
на
has had a
настроениях в
serious
этих
impact
регионах.
on the mood in these regions.
В Запорожской и
In
Херсонской области
Zaporozhye and
устраиваются
Kherson
очереди
oblasts,
за
people are
получением
lining up
российских
to
паспортов.
receive Russian passports.
Несмотря на то, что
Despite the
украинские
fact
власти
that
пытаются
Ukrainian
всячески
authorities are
запугать
trying to
своих
do everything
граждан,
they can to
совершая
intimidate their
теракты против
citizens and
сотрудников
carrying out
гражданских
terrorist
администраций
attacks
и
against
инициируя
those working for
уголовные
the city
преследования
administration and
за переход в
initiating
российское
criminal
гражданство,
proceedings for people moving
люди
over to
делают
Russian
выбор в
citizenship,
пользу той страны,
people
которой
are
они
choosing
доверяют,
the country that
в
they
пользу
trust.
нормального будущего
They're
для
choosing a
себя и своих
normal
детей.
future for themselves and their children.
Украина теряет этих
Ukraine
людей на
is
глазах,
losing
как в
these
свое
people
время она
before its
потеряла
eyes,
жителей
just as in the
Донбасса,
past it
против
lost the
которых
residents of
киевский режим
Donbass, against
в
whom the
2014
Kiev
году
regime
начал
in
войну на
2014
уничтожение.
began a war of annihilation.
Киевский режим
The Kiev
пытается
regime
мстить даже своим
is trying
военнослужащим,
to
которые
get vengeance
осознали
even on its
бессмысленность
own service
выполнения
personnel who
преступных
have
приказов
acknowledged the
и сдались в плен,
pointlessness of carrying
чтобы
out these
получить
criminal
шанс на
orders
искупление и мирную
and are
жизнь.
giving themselves up to have a chance of a
Сегодня
peaceful
утром из
life.
поставленных
This
США
morning
РСЗО
from
«Хаймарс» был обстрелян следственный изолятор около Еленовки в Донбассе,
somewhere near Yelenevsk in Donbass was shelled from these weapons received from the
в
United
результате
States,
чего
as a
погибло более
result of which
50
more than
пленных украинцев.
50 Ukrainian prisoners were killed.
Однако такие акции устрашения
However,
лишь
this act of
подстегнут процесс
intimidation
сдачи
only
мобилизованных украинцев в
incites
плен.
the mobilization and the motivation of
Массовые
Ukrainians to give
случаи
themselves
отказа
up.
воевать со
Mass
стороны
cases of
солдат
refusal
ВСУ
to
мы
fight
наблюдаем
among
ежедневно.
Ukrainian army soldiers are things we are seeing on a daily basis.
Не последнюю роль в упомянутом мною изменении настроений жителей юга Украины играет и то, что ВСУ продолжают свою излюбленную тактику по использованию объектов гражданской инфраструктуры в качестве укрытий и мест размещения тяжелой военной техники. О таком отношении киевского режима к своему народу рассказывают десятки очевидцев, которые, в отличие от так называемых свидетелей украинских и западных расследований, не скрывают своих имен и адресов. Они же указывают на целенаправленные удары ВСУ по гражданским объектам и расстрелы мирных жителей, которые потом выдаются за действия российских войск. Подобные постановки, типа пресловутой Бучи, находят все больше и больше опровержений, игнорировать который практически невозможно. Не замечают всего этого лишь наши западные коллеги, в чем мы могли сполна убедиться, в том числе на этом заседании. Наша британская коллега дала исчерпывающий список таких провокаций. Спасибо большое. Господин председатель, за прошедший месяц наметились подвижки в вопросах вывоза украинского зерна, а также доступа российской продукции и удобрений на мировые рынки. 22 июля в Стамбуле были подписаны два отдельных документа на этот счет, составляющие пакетное соглашение. Хочу подчеркнуть, что мы были готовы урегулировать эти вопросы еще в апреле, после их обсуждения на встрече в Москве президента Владимира Путина и Антонио Гутерреша. Но Киев и его западные кураторы пытались саботировать пакетный характер договоренности, выпячивая лишь ту их часть, которая касается украинского зерна. Это при том, что речь идет, по нашим данным, всего лишь о примерно 5 миллионов тонн, то есть о менее чем 1% общего зерна на мировом рынке. Благодарим Генсекретаря ООН и турецкую сторону за то, что они не пошли на поводу у западного лагеря, что во многом и позволило заключить упомянутые договоренности. Подписание меморандума России и ООН о содействии продвижению российских продуктов питания на мировые рынки лишний раз доказывает абсолютную неуместность попыток свалить на нашу страну вину за искусственно созданные действиями западных государств мировой продовольственный кризис, признаки которого мы наблюдаем все отчетливее. 26 июля начал работу совместный координационный центр по безопасной транспортировке зерна из украинских портов с участием представителей России, Турции и Украины при подключении сотрудников ООН. Рассчитываем, что в скором времени стамбульские договоренности начнут выполняться в полном объеме, а генсекретарь в соответствии с взятыми им обязательствами сделает все, чтобы устранить препятствия, созданные ЕС, США и США в области оплаты, страхования и логистики российских грузов. Кстати сказать, размещение военных грузов и объектов в порту Одессы вряд ли будет способствовать успешной реализации договоренностей по зерну. Мы будем продолжать уничтожать такие грузы и объекты, как это было сделано 23 июля, когда были уничтожены украинский военный корабль и склад поставленных в США противокорабельных ракет «Harpoon». Ничто в подписанном меморандуме не мешает нам продолжать обеспечивать демилитаризацию Украины. Господин председатель, за прошедший месяц прокси-война Запада с Россией до последнего украинца вышла на новый виток. С началом активных поставок украинскому режиму современных систем СЗО, которые используются им по наводке и под непосредственным контролем западных инструкторов, она вплотную подошла к прямой вовлеченности западных стран в конфликт. Свои спутниковые снимки для нанесения ударов Киеву охотно предоставляют так называемые частные западные компании. Мы уже не раз видели, как эти снимки используются для различного рода инсценировок и провокаций. Разумеется, мы не можем этого не учитывать. Что до поставляемого Киеву вооружения и оставшихся на территории Украины наемников, то они будут и далее уничтожаться российскими вооруженными силами, как легитимные военные цели. Бездумная накачка Украины тяжелыми вооружениями, артиллерийскими системами, огнестрельным оружием приводит к тому, что из-за процветающей в украинском политическом и военном руководстве коррупции это оружие расползается по Европе. Известно, что значительная его часть попадает в руки контрабандистов прямо со складов. Отлажены каналы его поставки на мировой черный рынок вооружения. О соответствующих сетевых ресурсах
Почти в открытую публикуется
websites, almost publicly, information about this is being published about the fact that these weapons are available.
Проблема достигла таких масштабов, что ее уже не могут замалчивать даже ведущие западные СМИ. Это был вынужден признать даже Европол.
Even Europol has been forced to acknowledge this.
На прошлой неделе его представитель Ян Опген-Орт в комментарии агентству DPA сообщил, что Европол в курсе сообщений о торговле тяжелым вооружением, а также о том, что у европейских правоохранителей есть информация о выезде с территории Украины людей с огнестрельным оружием. Он также подчеркнул, что сохраняется риск попадания всего этого в руки организованных преступных группировок или террористов. В ряде СМИ циркулируют утечки из конфиденциальной части доклада Европола, представленного Совету ЕС. В нем отмечается, что криминальные сети занимаются контрабандой значительного количества огнестрельного оружия и боеприпасов из Украины в страны ЕС. По оценке Европола, вдоль украинской границы ЕС были созданы тайники для хранения оружия. Наглядная иллюстрация этих выводов – результаты совместной операции правоохранительных органов Венгрии и Словакии по задержанию преступной группировки, занимавшейся контрабандой поставляемого в Украину оружия. Целый арсенал, включая снайперские винтовки, пулеметы и взрывчатые вещества, был обнаружен в венгерском населенном пункте Райка, в часе езды от главной международной разоруженческой площадки в Вене. По признанию одного из задержанных, найденные вооружения были поставлены Украине, предназначались для украинских вооруженных формирований, включая батальон Азов, а затем были проданы и доставлены на территорию ЕС. Хочу спросить наших западных коллег, вы точно осознаете последствия того, что вы делаете? У нас начинают возникать сомнения в этом. Ведь своими руками вы создаете в центре Европы региональный, а возможно и мировой хаб для нелегальных поставок вооружений, порождая тем самым реальные риски для своего населения, да еще и за счет ваших собственных налогоплательщиков. И не говорите нам, что мы вас не предупреждали, когда поставленное вами на Украину оружие всплывет, например, в зоне конфликта в одной из стран в других регионах мира, и от него пострадают ООНовские миротворцы. А также, если им для совершения теракта воспользуются экстремисты в самой Европе. При этом все ваши попытки накачивать украинский режим оружием лишь затягивают его агонию, увеличивая страдания украинского народа, используемого нынешними безответственными лидерами страны как пушечное мясо. Цели нашей специальной военной операции все равно будут выполнены, сколько бы вы ни подливали своим оружием масло в огонь. Господин председатель, в течение июля наши западные коллеги постарались обойти молчанием тот факт, что вооруженные силы Украины активно использовали напичканные взрывчаткой БПЛА иностранного производства для нападения на Запорожскую атомную электростанцию. Так, в результате атаки 20 июля на территории станции начался пожар, и только по счастливой случайности удалось избежать крупной аварии, последствия которой могли ощутить на себе все европейцы. Хочу подчеркнуть, речь идет о целенаправленной атаке ВСУ против ядерного объекта, крупнейшей в Европе атомной станции. Проблема была ликвидирована, и станция продолжает свою штатную работу под контролем российских военных. По всей этой истории нас больше всего потрясает чудовищное лицемерие западных стран, которые не дали никакой оценки этой безрассудной провокации киевского режима. А ведь еще в марте на заседании Совета Безопасности они раздували истерию по поводу мнимой радиологической угрозы, якобы созданной обстрелами Запорожской станции российскими военными, несмотря на то, что гендиректор МАГАТЭ публично опроверг ее наличие. Честно признаться, это очень напоминает преступную слепоту, которые западные страны демонстрировали, когда 7 лет покрывали невыполнение Киевом Минских соглашений. Печально, что такую же слепоту и двойные стандарты сейчас демонстрирует и руководство ООН. Такая безответственная линия только поощряет киевский режим к дальнейшим шагам, подрывающим ядерную безопасность на нашем континенте. Господин председатель, Хочу обратить внимание западных делегаций на то, что поставляемая вами дальнобойная артиллерия позволяет ВСУ дотянуться до тыловых районов Донбасса и безо всякой военной логики, исключительно в целях мести и устрашения, убивать мирных жителей. В качестве целей в Донецке, Херсоне, Стаханове, Горловке киевским режимом умышленно выбираются школы, больницы, жилые дома. Практически каждый день на Донбассе от обстрелов из полученных от стран НАТО дальнобойных систем гибнут от 5 до 10 человек, десятки получают ранения. Не видят всего этого только западные и украинские СМИ. Но от этого менее ужасными эти преступления не становятся. Снабжая Украину дальнобойной артиллерией, Запад становится прямым соучастником военных преступлений киевского режима. Особенно больно, когда от украинских обстрелов гибнут дети. Донбасс регулярно хоронит их вот уже 8 лет с момента начала украинской военной карательной операции в регионе. Позавчера, 27 июля, в ДНР прошел День памяти детей жертв войны на Донбассе. В этот день жители Донецка возлагали цветы и приносили игрушки к мемориалу на аллее ангелов. Во время минуты молчания в городе повисла тишина, которую не нарушили даже звуки артиллерии, несмотря на то, что обстрелы со стороны ВСУ велись в этот день с самого утра. Этот день выбран не случайно. 27 июля 2014 года в Горловке под Донецком во время обстрела украинскими войсками вместе с мамой погибла Кира Жук, которой не было еще и года. Я сейчас держу ее фотографию. Вместе с ней в тот день погибли еще 4 детей. Все они стали одними из первых жертв войны Киева против Донбасса, продолжающейся 8 лет. В их память в Донецке и появилась аллея ангелов с монументом, на котором высечены имена детей, убитых Украиной. Сейчас там 130 имен. Среди них, например, 13-летняя Анастасия Коноплева, чью фотографию я держу сейчас, погибшая от обстрела в 2015 году вместе со своими братом и сестрой в своей собственной квартире. К сожалению, этот ужасный список регулярно пополняется. С февраля в одной только ДНР погибло 249 мирных жителей, включая 16 детей. Я хочу, чтобы вы посмотрели на фотографии 10-летней Вероники Бадиной, погибшей 5 июля от обстрела ВСУ в Донецке, и 7-летней Маши Евтуховой, погибшей 6 июля на детской площадке вместе с еще 3 сверстниками. Я сознательно показываю вам именно их, не только потому, что Украина убила их в этом месяце. Они, как и 3 других детей, погибли от снарядов, выпущенных из западных артиллерийских установок. Пока вооруженные силы Украины их не получили, они до этих районов попросту не добивали, а теперь могут. А знаете, что в этот вечер, после убийства вооруженными силами Украины 5 детей подряд, заявил украинский президент Зеленский? Вы думаете, он выразил соболезнования родителям, потерявшим самое дорогое? Нет. Я процитирую это его заявление. Начало цитаты. Наконец-то чувствуется, что очень мощно заработала западная артиллерия. То оружие, которое мы получили от наших партнеров. Ее точность действительно такая, как нужно. Конец цитаты. Я сейчас обращаюсь к моим американским, британским и французским коллегам, сидящим в этом зале. Я хочу, чтобы вы это четко поняли. Из поставляемого вашими странами на Украину оружия, приобретаемого на деньги ваших налогоплательщиков, убивают детей. А президент этой страны еще и открыто глумится над этим, восхваляя точность вашего оружия. Вы именно этого хотели добиться? А если нет, то где слова вашего осуждения подобного неслыханного кощунства? Наверное, некоторые сейчас в этом зале подумали, что украинский режим убивает детей в Донбассе ненарочно. И их гибель скорее, используя терминологию наших бывших американских партнеров, побочный эффект от военных действий. Вынужден вас разочаровать, это делается сознательно. Покажу вам еще одну фотографию.
Знаете, что это такое?
Do you know what this is?
Это мина-лепесток,
This is a lipstick
устанавливаемая
mine,
дистанционно, которую сейчас активно разбрасывают в Донбассе кассетными боеприпасами украинские войска. Ее особенность в том, что она размером с ладонь, практически незаметна на земле и очень похожа на детскую игрушку. Если ее тронуть или на нее наступить, раздается взрыв. Взрослого человека он покалечит, а ребенка почти наверняка убьет. Так вот, ответьте мне, зачем разбрасывать эти смертельные игрушки глубоко в тылу, посреди мирных городов? Ответ очевиден, чтобы убить как можно больше детей. Такая жестокость может кого-то поставить в тупик. Но те, кто присутствовал на наших двух последних неформальных заседаниях Совета Безопасности по формуле Ария, прекрасно понимают, что корни этой ненависти жителям Юга и Востока Украины в идеологии украинского национализма и неонацизма. Мир узнает еще много нелицеприятных фактов об этих ужасных явлениях, на которые западные покровители Украины предпочитают не обращать внимания. И вот наглядный результат вашей слепоты. Уважаемые коллеги, после демонстрации этих детских фотографий, я думаю, излишне даже говорить, что денацификация и демилитаризация Украины будет осуществлена в полном объеме. Из этого государства больше не должна исходить угроза ни Донбассу, ни России, ни освобожденным украинским территориям, где люди впервые за несколько лет почувствовали, что значит жить так, как они этого хотят. В заключение хотел бы вновь обратиться к нашим западным коллегам. Поставляя Украине дальнобойные артиллерийские системы и РСЗО, вы, по сути, сдвигаете необходимую для мирного развития упомянутых районов условную линию безопасности дальше на запад, уточняя таким образом цели и задачи нашей специальной военной операции. Задумайтесь над этим, как и над тем, что после ее окончания вам так или иначе все равно придется жить рядом с нами и сотрудничать. Условия для этого этапа вы сейчас во многом задаете сами. И поверьте, что ваша готовность помогать украинцам убивать донецких и луганских детей вряд ли будет забыта как украинским, так и российским народом. Спасибо за внимание.
I thank the representative of the Russian Federation for his statement, and I give the floor now to the representative of Kenya.
Thank you, Mr. President. The Kenya delegation wishes Ambassador Geraldine Nason great success in her next assignment as Ireland's chief representative to the United States. Geraldine, your determination and persistence in pursuit of the security of the most vulnerable will be missed in the Security Council. I thank Undersecretary General Rosemary DiCarlo for sharing her assessment of the dire situation in Ukraine and the efforts that are underway to relieve the humanitarian crisis. Kenya applauds the leadership of the Secretary General in facilitating an agreement between Ukraine and Russia to safely export Ukraine's food products using the Black Sea and also enabling food and fertilizer exports from Russia. I am sure the entire membership appreciates President Recep Erdogan and the government of Turkey for the key role played in the negotiations and as a guarantor. Increased exports of food products and fertilizer will bring some relief to the suffering millions across the world. It is also a much-needed victory for the United Nations at a time when our collective faith in multilateralism is at such a low ebb. At the start of what we were told was a special military operation in Ukraine, we believed that there was still time for diplomacy to protect the territorial integrity of Ukraine. More than 5 months have passed since then, and we are now witness to a brutal war of attrition that shows little inclination to a ceasefire in favor of negotiations. We mourn the terrible suffering it is causing to Ukrainians, and few countries, including Kenya, have escaped its baleful effects. Unfortunately, we must now additionally contend with the increasingly clear fact that the militaristic energies loosed by the war in Ukraine threaten a new war of major global conflicts. Mr. President, it is right that we should use this briefing and every available platform to sound this warning to the members of the United Nations. in the hope that it will spur a united resistance to the present course we are on. If we fail to inspire or pressure the warring parties and their allies to the table, then I hope that we shall use the regional and global instruments available to us to find some degree of security. Mr. President, it is time we also deliberated on responses to the global threats of the situation in Ukraine. The European security order is in ruins. It has been replaced by military political alliances preparing for war and trying to deter and contain one another. The situation in Europe today is a dire threat to international peace and security. Its great power alliances and their projections of power are endangering the stability of the Korean Peninsula and the South China Sea, to mention just two potential flashpoints. The escalation of the present competition and rivalry can easily escalate into conflict that will lay waste to the world economy and lead to the proxy wars of the Cold War. At a minimum, it will mean that the sea lanes vital to the transportation of our goods in our globalized economy will not be open and secure. And that globalization itself, which has been a great engine for development, will grind to a halt or even be reversed. The race for technological development is more than ever weaponized and part of an emerging contest between great powers. There is now as great, if not a greater chance, for cutting-edge technologies like artificial intelligence leading to even more destructive wars more than being engines for shared prosperity. Their production and procurement, rather than responding to the reforms to governance that developing countries have been asked to make for a generation, will now be allocated along geopolitical lines. Meanwhile, a future of extreme political and economic instability, leading to the impoverishment and death of millions from the effects of climate change, looms. Mr. President, sitting here in the Security Council, it is difficult to argue that our briefings, debates, and decisions meaningfully respond to these profound threats to international peace and security. That needs to change so that the world does not turn its back to this hallowed chamber, which still has useful tools to help relieve and even solve some of the challenges I have described. It is not enough for Kenya to only sound the alarm. We must use the urgency of this moment to take more ambitious and courageous actions to rescue multilateralism and our common peace. To that end, Mr. President, allow me to make 5 recommendations. First, the world will believe in the mandate of the Security Council if it can assist deliver a cessation of hostilities in Ukraine and support a lasting settlement that stabilizes the European security order. The Council should do that while respecting the sovereignty, territorial integrity, and political independence of Ukraine. As difficult as it is to achieve these goals, they are the minimum required if the Security Council is to be credible and able to take on the other challenges I have outlined. Second, the Security Council must stop being the echo chamber for growing appeals for humanitarian aid as millions of lives around the world are threatened by extreme food insecurity. The conflict in Ukraine, like the COVID pandemic, has proved that distributed production, particularly in Africa and the developing world, is a key safety net. If the great powers want to make their case to Africa, they should start by partnering with us to deliver fertilizer independence and gains in our agricultural productivity. Third, agreeing to meet and even exceed the Paris climate commitments at the upcoming COP27 in Egypt is a minimum deliverable by the industrialized countries. In addition, climate adaptation and mitigation should be a core operating system in the international financial institutions and every government, to the point that there are fundamental changes to the global financial system and its treatment of debt and investment in the developing world. It should respond robustly to regions suffering extreme climate change effects and that are in need of strong and shared development. Fourth, we believe that the useful work that the World Bank has done in fragility, conflict, and violence is a promising foundation for action. It should be strongly coordinated with climate change action, as I have described briefly, and to the peace-building agenda of the United Nations. The Bank's development knowledge and resources, coordinated with the UN's humanitarian aid, peace-building, and peacekeeping knowledge, plus its ground presence, can make real inroads in delivering peace and resilience. Fifth, and finally, Mr. President, it is an outcome of a great war that the most powerful states in the United Nations should also be among the greatest shareholders in the Bretton Woods institutions. Even while needing substantial reforms for inclusion, these institutions can still offer ambitious solutions to the major challenges we face. We believe that the Secretary General's Global Crisis Response Group on Food, Energy, and Finance offers a valuable platform for action in the short term. Its recommendations and solutions should receive sufficient financial and operational support and be a bridge to longer-term ambitious reforms and initiatives if we're to save multilateralism and protect our common peace. I thank you, Mr. President, and congratulate you for Brazil's responsible, professional, and skilled presidency for the month of July.
I thank the representative of Kenya for his statement, and I give the floor to the representative of Ireland.
Thank you very much, Mr. President, and I want to thank you for your very generous tribute to me at the start of what is my last meeting in this chair at this table. Your remarks were very warm and touching. Gaurav Mila Mahagat. I would also like to thank all my colleagues for their kind remarks. I will miss you. Working alongside you in this chamber, most of the time as we do, in defence of international peace and security, has been the privilege of a lifetime and career. Again, Gaurav Mila Mahagat. President, on 22nd July, Ireland welcomed the signing of the Black Sea Grain Initiative, which will, once implemented, help reduce pressure on those countries suffering as a result of food supply constraints and high prices. We know that this agreement did not come easy. We commend Ukraine and Russia for overcoming the obstacles necessary to make it possible. We deeply appreciate the tireless efforts of the Secretary-General and his team. We also recognise the important contribution of President Erdogan and the government of Turkey to bring the sides closer together. In the words of the Secretary-General, the agreement is a ray of hope in a world darkened by global crises. In the past year, global food prices have risen by nearly 1/3 and up to 95 million, that's 95 million more people, many of whom are already enduring hunger exacerbated by the impacts of climate change, conflict, disease, and the global impacts of the coronavirus pandemic. 95 million more could be plunged into acute food insecurity as a result. We urge the full and immediate implementation of the initiative. Simply put, it couldn't be more urgent. That is why the Russian attack on the port of Odessa, less than 24 hours after the agreement was signed, was particularly cynical. We condemn this reprehensible act outright. All parties made clear commitments to ensure the safe movement of Ukrainian grain to global markets to help address the global food crisis, to help reduce pressure on high prices, and to help ease the suffering of millions, including in places already devastated by hunger, like Somalia, Ethiopia, Yemen, and Lebanon. We urge all sides to act in good faith and to implement their commitments without delay. Ireland has been crystal clear since joining this Council on the irrefutable link between conflict and hunger. We encourage those who have been reluctant, I would say unwilling, to recognise this link, to think again, to reconsider their position, to look at this global crisis. Mr. President, while we welcome last Friday's agreement, we mustn't forget why this agreement was needed in the first place. For more than 5 months, Russia has waged an unprovoked, unjustified war against Ukraine in violation of international law, a war that is an absolute affront to our UN Charter. Most of us here every day dedicate ourselves to protecting and promoting the Charter. The Charter is our touchstone. This war is a violation of that precious Charter. With each passing day, new harrowing testimony emerges. Innocent men and women targeted by gunfire while evacuating to save their own lives. Children condemned for life to relive the indiscriminate bombing and shelling of their homes, their schools, their playgrounds. Elderly Ukrainians speaking of being brutalized and starved in their own homes. Across the country, civilians are being targeted, displaced, and dying as a consequence of a war not in any way of their making. Just this month, a Russian cruise missile hit civilian areas of Vinnytsia in central Ukraine, killing at least 22 people and injuring more than 100. Amongst those reported to have been killed was a 4-year-old girl with Down syndrome. Absolute depravity. This is not Russia's first attack on Ukraine's towns and cities, as we know too well, but it speaks to a worrying trend of attacks on civilian targets that appear to have just one goal in mind: to intimidate and terrorize the civilian population. Let me be clear, those responsible for such attacks must be held to account. Across Ukraine, attacks on civilian infrastructure have also left millions without access to basic health services, to water, to electricity, to gas, to adequate shelter. We have all seen the images and we have read the reports. Women giving birth in bomb shelters and hospital basements with no electricity for incubators. Unconscionable. Children at imminent risk of being cut off from safe drinking water. Families forced to flee due to fear of bombardment and war, or because the lack of electricity and heat in their homes, their own homes, have become and have made them unlivable. Needs are expected to grow as long hostilities continue, promising to exacerbate an already dire humanitarian situation as winter now soon approaches. We once again call on the Russian Federation to comply with its obligations under international law. Full stop. Parties to the conflict must comply with international humanitarian law, including the obligation to distinguish between civilians and combatants and to attack only military objectives, the prohibitions against indiscriminate and disproportionate attacks, and the obligation to take all feasible precautions in attack. I've said it before, I'll say it for the last time, compliance isn't an option. We urge the parties to facilitate full, safe, and unhindered humanitarian access to those in need of life-saving assistance and medical support. President, Russia alone bears responsibility for this war. Russia alone can end it. It's high time. I call on the Russian Federation once again to put an end to this needless suffering, to comply with its obligations under international law, and to withdraw all its forces unconditionally from the entire sovereign territory of Ukraine. Thank you, President.
I thank the representative of Ireland for her statement, and I give the floor to the representative of Gabon.
Merci, Monsieur le Président.
Thank you, President. I would also like to wish, on behalf of Gabon, the greatest success to Ambassador Geraldine
dans ses nouvelles fonctions
as she prepares to take her new post. We are proud to have cooperated with you, Madam, with all of the issues that the Security Council considers. President, we carefully listened to the briefing of Madame Di Carlo on the prevailing situation in Ukraine. I would like to make some remarks in my turn. As the war in Ukraine enters its 6th month, we hail the signing of the agreement on grains last Friday in Istanbul. This agreement, signed with the encouragement of the United Nations and the facilitation of Turkey, will make it possible to respond to the food needs of several countries, particularly African countries, that depend on grain supplies from Russia and Ukraine. This unprecedented event bears witness to what parties to the conflict are able to do when they overcome their differences for the common good. The implementation of this agreement will need all the more commitment from the parties in order for it to produce all of the expected results. President, the humanitarian consequences of the war can and must be contained. The signing of this agreement is a development which can trigger a positive dynamic. We encourage the countries to take advantage of the momentum to consider additional steps to resolve the crisis. The conclusion of a ceasefire is both urgent, necessary, and within reach, as long as the parties agree to redouble their efforts to reach this goal. To conclude, I wish to express Gabon's support to the initiatives for political resolution of the war, particularly the good offices of the Secretary General. Thank you very much.
I thank the representative of Gabon for her statement. I shall now make a statement in my capacity as the representative of Brazil. I thank the missions of Albania and the United States for proposing this meeting, and I thank Under-Secretary General Di Carlo for her briefing. Distinguished colleagues, this month we all became aware of military actions in Odessa, Chasiv Yar, Vinnytsia, Chuiv, Kharkiv, and other Ukrainian cities, which claimed the lives of dozens of victims. Attacks against civilians are unjustifiable under international humanitarian law. We reiterate the call for the parties to act with restraint and prevent further civilian casualties as a side effect of the hostilities. Since the beginning of the conflict 5 months ago, we have insisted on the need for engagement in constructive and pragmatic dialogue that will limit the immense losses imposed on Ukraine and begin the process of re-establishment of peace. The conflict and its associated sanctions have aggravated disturbing trends around the world. Rising food and fuel prices, as well as the threat of a supply crisis, are hitting developing countries hardest. The agreement announced last Friday brought with it the hope that political solutions can be achieved. Negotiations between the parties resulted in a concrete response to an urgent problem. The two agreements in Istanbul paved the way for the resumption of exports of grains and fertilizer, and the reintegration of the two countries into international markets. We thank the Secretary General and the government of Turkey for their decisive role in brokering the agreements. Brazil shares the disappointment expressed by other members for the incapacity of the Security Council to reach consensus for the approval of a presidential or a press statement. We should, however, welcome the parties' active engagement in the negotiations. We urge both sides to avoid actions that could jeopardize the implementation of the agreements. The insistence on the search for a decisive result on the battlefield will only result in greater destruction. Although the last few months seem to have downplayed the role of diplomacy in dealing with the crisis, it is precisely in the face of the greatest challenges that we must remain committed to the spirit of the United Nations and devote all our efforts to achieve lasting peace. Let us not be carried away by the impulse to close the doors to dialogue. The Istanbul Accords point to a viable path. The immediate resumption of direct negotiations between the parties for the end to hostilities must be the priority of this Council in order to stop the escalation of violence and avoid the loss of thousands of human lives. I now resume my function as President of the Council. I would like to draw the attention of speakers to paragraph 22 of note 507, which encourages all participants in Council meetings to deliver their statements in 5 minutes or less, in line with the Security Council's commitment to making more effective use of open meetings. I now give the floor to the representative of Ukraine.
Well, thank you, Mr. President. And before I start my intervention, I would like to join everyone who thanked Geraldine for being our good colleague and doing an extremely great job. And although, for whatever reason, Geraldine, you decided to move south as if it is not hot enough here, the Irish spirit, Ireland, will stay with us. And we value very much the integrity of your country. And we are looking forward to work whoever replaces you. Thank you very much. Mr. President, distinguished members of the Security Council, Madam Under-Secretary General, I also recognize here the representatives of terrorist Russia in the permanent seat of the Soviet Union. There is plenty of evidence of the terrorist nature of current Russian regime, and the most horrifying ones continue to emerge. Yesterday, a video was posted in Russian Telegram channels to show a Ukrainian prisoner of war being castrated by his Russian captors, a group of men in Russian uniform, which featured a Z patch. Some of the Russian soldiers who appear in the footage were earlier filmed on the front lines in Donbass back in June. After the cruel and inhumane torture, the victim was killed. The Prosecutor General Office of Ukraine will investigate the event, and we will inform you of the outcomes of the investigation. Today, Russia has committed another petrifying war crime by blasting a penitentiary in the occupied Olenivka, Donetsk region, where it held Ukrainian prisoners of war, mostly from the Azov regiment. The Russian occupiers pursued their criminal goals in order to accuse Ukraine of committing war crimes, as well as to cover up the torture and executions of prisoners which they carried out there. It speaks volumes that so-called DPR ombudsperson, Morozova, informed that there were no casualties among the staff of the colony. I would like to express my gratitude to the Brazilian presidency for organizing today's meeting. The issue of the Russian war against Ukraine remains as relevant as ever, because we observe no de-escalation on the ground, and Russia has not given up its aggressive and neo-colonial plans with respect to Ukraine. Moreover, Russian Minister Lavrov went even further, claiming recently that geographical objectives of the so-called special operation had been expanded to a number of other territories. Indeed, it sounded like base wish of a thief to keep possession of what has been stolen. One can hardly expect that Russian behavior in the Council and on the ground will differ. It took less than 24 hours for Russia to manifestly go against the above initiative signed in Istanbul on the 22nd July and shell Odessa port with missiles. One of 3 ports it has committed not to attack according to the above document. As always, Russia contradicted itself in its excuses. Initially, as reported, Russia denied its responsibility for the attack altogether. On the next day, realizing that it is outright lie is obvious to everyone, Russia was compelled to change the story. It assumed responsibility, however, by telling another lie that a missile store in Odessa port was targeted. A lie that was easily refuted by extensive footage from the site showing no sign of secondary detonation of alleged Ukrainian missiles. We are grateful to the Secretary General for his unequivocal condemnation of this attack. His clear assessment made futile all Russian attempts to create artificial caveats that the Istanbul documents have never contained. Ukraine remains resolute to contribute to resolving the food crisis. We will engage constructively with the activities of the Joint Coordination Center, officially inaugurated in Istanbul on the 27th of July. Now, it is the responsibility of international partners to ensure Russia's compliance with its obligations within the framework of the safe functioning of the grain corridor. This is the only prerequisite for unlocking more than 20 million tons of grain from last year's grain harvest in Ukraine. Today, President Zelenski has visited Chornomorsk Sea Trade Port, where the first grain carrier since the beginning of the war has been loaded with Ukrainian grain. Now we are waiting for a green light from partners, representatives of the United Nations and Turkey, regarding the start of grain transportation. Mr. President, it is outrageous that Russia still tries to disseminate fakes instead of fulfilling its obligations. To be frank, a diplomatic note sent this week and signed by the Russian Charge should be subject to consideration by medical specialists rather than the Security Council members. Let me quote from it just one sentence. The Russian armed forces do not target civilian infrastructure. End of quote. Seriously? Does the Russian diplomat believe that the Security Council is the studio of a Skabeyeva show? If it is an early sign of insanity defense, let it be remembered that the war crimes and crimes against humanity committed by the Nazis during the Second World War were not a result of medical insanity or illness. They were committed collectively by thousands of individuals, Hitlers like Putin's today, henchmen, officers, and diplomats, who were working hard to please and execute the leader's wish and orders, even if the orders were not easily traceable. Luckily, in the case of that diplomatic note, it is clearly signed in ink, and it will be preserved as evidence. Since our last meeting, the list of Russian war crimes has been added to with further bloody and shameful pages, added daily, if not hourly. Just a few examples. On the 1st of July, Russian missiles hit a residential building and 2 resorts in Serhiivka village, Odessa region, killing 19 people and injuring 34. 48 civilian residents, including a child, were killed following Russian missiles targeting a 5-story apartment building in the city of Chasiv Yar, Donetsk region, on July the 9th. On the 14th of July, the world was shocked by the Russian missile strike on the city center of Vinnytsia. 26 civilians, including 3 children, were killed, and almost 90 were wounded. Yesterday, Russian terrorists increased the number of casualties among Ukrainians with missile shelling, including from the territory of Belarus, of Krapivnitsky, Lyutish in Kyiv region, and Khancherivske in Chernigiv region. Kharkiv and Mykolaiv sustained heavy rocket and artillery shelling on an almost daily basis. This morning, Russians shelled a bus stop area in Mykolaiv with cluster munitions, killing 5 and wounding 7 civilians. Earlier, many of you might have seen a heartbreaking picture taken in Kharkiv on the 20th of July. The picture is of a man praying while holding the hand of his 13-year-old son killed at a bus stop by a Russian Uragan missile. Killing innocent children, that is what the Russian murderers call denazification. Another declared goal, so-called demilitarization, means razing Ukrainian cities to the ground. Civilian infrastructure is among the primary targets. As of June, for instance, the Russian war has led to the destruction or damage of 116,000 residential buildings that were home for 3.5 million Ukrainians. 183 religious sites, including 173 Christian, 5 Muslim, and 5 Jewish sites, were destroyed in 14 Ukrainian regions. Just visualize how Russian soldiers, blessed by Orthodox Patriarch Kirill, have destroyed almost 200 Orthodox churches in Ukraine. Pictures of Ukrainian children lying on the ground of destroyed Ukrainian cities and villages have been the reality of the past 5 months of the war. A reality that we will never get used to, we will never accept, and we will never forgive. Russia has resorted to terrorism to intimidate and to undermine our resolve to resist. To this end, they have shelled more than 3,000 missiles on cities and villages throughout Ukraine. The effect, however, is quite the opposite, and Ukrainian society is united in its aspiration to liberate our sovereign territories and to bring all those responsible for the killing and destruction to justice. Mr. President, let me quote a person who spent days, months, and years in this very hall, who chaired the Security Council, and who nevertheless said, and I quote, "There is nothing in the obligations that Russia has taken on, including within the framework of the agreements signed on July 22 in Istanbul, which would prohibit us from continuing the special military operation," end of quote. It means, as a matter of fact, there is nothing that would deter Russia from killing and destroying. There is no UN Charter for Russia. There are no Geneva Conventions for Russia. There are no moral restraints to Mr. Lavrov. It is time to say it clear and loud to the Russian delegate. You are here because we let you be here for reasons that have proven to be wrong. We, all of us, tolerate your presence just because we need to remind you daily that you will be held accountable for war crimes and that the Soviet seat in this council will not help you escape the punishment that you deserve. You deserve as a state, you deserve as each and every one of you individually in the Russian war cell in Manhattan. I thank you, Mr. President.
I thank the representative of Ukraine for his statement. And I give the floor now to the representative of Slovakia.
Thank you, Mr. President. Over more than 150 days after beginning the senseless war of the Russian Federation against Ukraine, and despite multiple calls of the international community addressed to the Russian Federation to immediately cease its hostilities, severe bombardments of cities and rockets flying over heads of innocent civilians continue to be a horrific daily reality of Ukrainian population. Those attacks have resulted in a significant increase of civilian casualties. According to OHCHR, over 12,000 so far, from whom over 5,000 killed and 7,000 wounded. Needless to say that the reality is much worse. In this regard, we have to be reminded of the reason why the Russian Federation started this unjustified and unprovoked aggression against Ukraine in blatant violation of international law, simply due to the right of Ukraine to decide its own future. The decision, which would have brought a prosperity for the country, a well-being of its citizens, who are now forced to live in fear and see massive destruction of their homes and critical civilian infrastructure. In this vein, the respect for the international humanitarian law must be ensured. We would also like to seize this opportunity to once again condemn the Russian propaganda and related distortion of facts and promotion of alternative reality, which Russian Federation also expressed today, including with respect to my country. This is highly deplorable, and we totally reject such allegations. Mr. President, let me be clear. The aggressor accountable for this situation is evident. It is the Russian Federation which only can decide to stop this war at once, and we call on the Russian Federation to do so without further delay. Slovakia, together with other states and stakeholders, already made a commitment to help Ukraine in its reconstruction and recovery as soon as this nightmare is over. Ukraine will undoubtedly flourish once again, but the blood of victims of this senseless war will be forever dried on the palms of the heads of the Russian Federation. Mr. President, while speaking about civilians, we must also mention hundreds of millions of people experiencing acute food insecurity throughout the world. Through its war in Ukraine, the Russian Federation, and only the Russian Federation, is responsible for aggravating the global food security crisis. Slovakia welcomes the agreement to unblock the Black Sea for exports of grain, which was signed last week, and we praise Turkey and the United Nations for their effort and crucial role in reaching this agreement. On the other hand, we were horrified that only one day after signing the agreement, Russian missiles hit Odessa port, which can only be considered as total disregard for international law by the Russian Federation. We urge the Russian Federation to refrain from any additional action having potential to hamper the implementation of the agreement, which is an important step in overcoming the global food insecurity caused by the Russian aggression against Ukraine. I would like to thank you for your attention.
I thank the representative of Slovakia for his statement. I now give the floor to Mr. Thibault Cameli, chargé d'affaires of the delegation of the European Union to the United Nations.
Thank you, President. I have the honor to deliver this statement on behalf of the European Union and its member states. At the outset, allow me to join all praises to Ambassador Byrne. Dear Geraldine, it's very clear you will be missed in this chamber, and the same is also true for your friends in the European Union. Good luck in DC. Mr. President, we welcome today's discussions on Ukraine and thank Brazil for organizing this meeting. It is essential that the Security Council remains seized of Russia's war of aggression against Ukraine. I would like to thank USG DiCarlo for a briefing and updates. And I would like to focus my intervention on 3 points. First, I wish to address the continued violations of the UN Charter by the Russian Federation. The European Union continues to condemn in the strongest terms the unprovoked and illegal war of aggression against Ukraine by Russia, aided by Belarus. This blatant violation of international law, and in particular the United Nations Charter, is having devastating consequences in Ukraine and around the world. It seriously undermines the international rule-based system that underpins global peace and security and forms the bedrock of this organization. As expressed by the overwhelming majority of UN member states, we reiterate our demand that Russia, as a permanent member of the Security Council, immediately ends its war, unconditionally ceases all hostilities, and withdraws its troops and military equipment from the entire territory of Ukraine within its internationally recognized borders. We also condemn the announced preparations for staged referendum in parts of the Kherson region on joining the Russian Federation. The international community will not recognize the result of such an illegal referendum. In response to Russia's aggression, the EU remains steadfast in its support to Ukraine, together with our partners, in its courageous defense of its sovereignty and territorial integrity. Second, international humanitarian law must be respected. We condemn the heinous and repeated attacks by the Russian armed forces on civilians and civilian infrastructure. In the past month alone, Russian missile strikes have killed innocent civilians, including children, across most regions of Ukraine. The continued shelling of civilians and civilian objects is unacceptable and amounts to war crimes. Russia bears full responsibility for these crimes and will be held accountable for them. We further urge Russia to allow safe, rapid, and unimpeded humanitarian access without delay, enabling aid to be delivered to those in need. Third and last, I would like to highlight the importance of efforts to alleviate global food insecurity. The European Union welcomes the progress announced last week in Istanbul towards ensuring the safe and secure export of Ukrainian grains via the Black Sea ports. We commend the role of Turkey and the United Nations in facilitating this positive outcome, which has the potential to significantly ease global food insecurity. The European Union has been consistently supportive of these efforts, and in particular we congratulate the Secretary General, Rebecca Greenspan, Martin Griffith, and their teams for their relentless efforts. It is now essential that all parties swiftly and in good faith implement the commitments made. The initial indications that grain cargo ships can leave already in the next days give us hope. However, we strongly condemn the missile strike carried out by Russia on the port of Odessa less than a day after they signed the agreement and in the following days. This defies the deal reached to allow grain exports from blockaded Ukrainian ports. The attacks once again demonstrate Russia's disregard for international law and commitments made. The European Union is firmly committed to supporting the food security of our partners worldwide by increasing our humanitarian assistance, supporting food production, and getting Ukrainian grain to world markets. The EU-Ukraine Solidarity Lanes Plan has facilitated the export of 2.5 million tons in June alone, up from 0.6 million in April. We also strongly support the United Nations-led efforts to promote a swift multilateral response to address the global food security crisis. In this context, we are mobilizing over 7.7 billion euros until 2024 to support the most affected partners around the world, and we are working closely with our member states to further step up these efforts. I emphasize once again that the European Union has no sanctions on the agricultural sector in Russia. EU sanctions do not prevent Russia-flagged vessels from carrying out grain, food, or fertilizers to any third country. We are ready to look into issues such as market avoidance or over-compliance and will address any concrete obstacles that are raised. Lastly, let us not forget that Russia itself is aggravating the global food crisis with its war of aggression against Ukraine and its repeated attacks against Ukraine grains field, storage, and transport facilities. If Russia is truly committed to alleviating the situation all over the world, and in Africa in particular, it must immediately stop its war. President, in conclusion, let me reiterate the full solidarity of the European Union with Ukraine and the Ukrainian people. We will continue to provide strong support, including humanitarian, economic, political, and military assistance for as long as it takes. The EU is also firmly committed to demonstrating global responsibility and solidarity in addressing the international impacts of Russia's aggression, especially on the most vulnerable. I thank you, Mr. President.
I thank Mr. Kameli for his statement. I now give the floor to the representative of Latvia.
Mr. President, I would also like to begin by thanking Permanent Representative of Ireland for her excellent service in Security Council. Mr. President, I have the honor to speak on behalf of the Baltic countries, Estonia, Lithuania, and my own country, Latvia. We welcome this meeting of the Security Council to address the implications of Russia's aggression against Ukraine, including the consequences for the UN Charter. We thank the Under-Secretary General Rosemary DiCarlo for her update today. As it is well known, the UN Charter prohibits the use of force except for self-defense and in cases when the Security Council has granted an authorization. Russia's unprovoked large-scale attack on Ukraine does not qualify under any of these exceptions and must therefore be considered as use of force in blatant violation of the UN Charter. Such actions by a permanent member of the Council shake the foundation upon which the United Nations were built. If Russia's aggression is not stopped and perpetrators are not held accountable, it may induce other actors to follow its path and further erode the international rules-based order. Unfortunately, it will always be the civilian population which will pay the highest price in the face of such violations. This week, we have entered the 6th month of Russia's aggression against Ukraine, aided by Belarus. The latter was vividly on display yesterday, when a barrage of 25 missiles were launched at northern Ukraine from the territory of Belarus. Every single day of Russia's war has brought devastation and suffering to the people of Ukraine. Atrocity crimes in Bucha and Irpin, bombing of maternity hospital in Mariupol, missile attacks on busy train station in Kramatorsk and crowded shopping center in Kremenchuk have been but a few of the most visible cases of Russia's blatant disregard for human life in its savage campaign against Ukraine's freedom, independence and statehood, as well as its sovereignty and territorial integrity. As per the latest report of the Office of the High Commissioner for Human Rights, a total of more than 5,200 civilian deaths are documented in Ukraine. Numbers are growing every day since new crimes against civilians are discovered and new attacks on civilians are executed regularly by the Russian military. Make no mistake, Russia's warfare against the civilian population of Ukraine is not a coincidence or collateral damage. It is a deliberate and consistent approach throughout Russia's war aimed at breaking the resistance and spirit of Ukrainian people. Unable to defeat Ukraine in the battlefield, Russia's military seeks to achieve its aims by terrorizing Ukraine's civilian population. One has the right to ask, how can it be possible that such actions, which clearly amount to war crimes, are permitted to be systematically carried out for months in direct violation of international law, including international humanitarian law? The answer lies in the sense of impunity, which characterizes Russia's approach to its international obligations. Russia must believe it can get away with its bloody crimes. It should be recognized that this sense of impunity is emboldened each time when members of international community, including around this table, fail to condemn Russia's actions and take steps to respond to its aggression. Mr. President, this is a high time for the international community to demonstrate that the norms, including the UN Charter, which have been established over decades to ensure peace and stability, as well as protection of civilians, are not empty statements that can be trampled down by dictators and bullies, but ironclad obligations which we are collectively determined to uphold. The only way to achieve this is by ensuring accountability at all levels for atrocities committed against Ukraine and its people. In this regard, it is of utmost importance to provide all necessary support to the work of Prosecutor of the International Criminal Court, the Independent International Commission of Inquiry mandated by the United Nations Human Rights Council, and the work of the expert missions under the Moscow mechanism of the Organization for Security and Cooperation in Europe, as well as investigation by the Office of the Prosecutor General of Ukraine. Justice must prevail. The perpetrators must and will be held accountable. Last but not least, Russia has added a global dimension to its campaign of terror by deliberately blocking the export of Ukraine's grains in order to cause a global food crisis. This is done with the clear aim to exert pressure on the international community and Ukraine. We welcome the agreement reached in Istanbul on 22nd of July to unblock Ukraine's Black Sea grain export. However, Russia's missile attack on Ukraine's port city of Odessa the very next day after the deal was signed once again proves that Russia cannot be trusted. International community must follow closely Russia's adherence to the deal and maintain pressure to ensure its implementation. I thank you.
I thank the representative of Latvia for his statement, and I give the floor now to the representative of Germany.
Thank you, Mr. President. I would like also to thank the Brazilian presidency for organizing this meeting and for the opportunity to speak in the Council today. I'm grateful for the briefing of USG Di Carlo. It was very insightful. Thank you. Further, I want to commend the Secretary General and the Republic of Turkey for their good offices to ensure the safe and secure export of Ukrainian food through the Black Sea Initiative. Germany strongly supports all efforts towards providing unhindered access of Ukrainian and Russian grain, foodstuff, and fertilizers to global markets. These products are vital. They are vital to address a worsening global food crisis. The agreement brokered last Friday in Istanbul by the UN and Turkey offered a faint glimmer of hope for those suffering most from the devastating consequences of the war around the globe. But yet missile strikes by Russia on the Ukrainian port of Odessa have imperiled the full and swift implementation of these agreements. Germany firmly condemns these attacks, which resulted in at least 19 civilian casualties, as we have publicly expressed in the strongest possible terms. Dear colleagues, despite these inhumane strikes, we are seeing hopeful signs that the first batch of grain exports might be able to leave Ukrainian ports soon. And while Russia does not miss out any given opportunity to distort the facts and blame Western sanctions, there can be no doubt, ever since Russia invaded Ukraine, food and energy prices have increased around the world, sowing chaos in supply chains, worsening global inflation, and inflicting economic and humanitarian suffering on millions of vulnerable people. Whilst humanitarian needs are at all-time high, Germany is continuously engaged with its humanitarian assistance, especially through the World Food Programme. The Berlin Conference, Uniting for Global Food Security on June 24th, highlighted the current challenges and the urgency to provide additional assistance as quickly as possible. At the summit in Elmau on June 28th, the G7 stood firm against Russia's weaponization of grain and provided an additional $4.5 billion US, thereof $476 million US in new commitments from the German government. to protect the world's most vulnerable from hunger and malnutrition. My message to the countries and people affected by the repercussions of Russia's war of aggression is once and again, you can count on our full support and solidarity. We once again call on Russia to stop its aggression immediately. Let us join hands against Russia's unprovoked and illegal war of aggression, not only in defense of the UN Charter, but also in the interest of global food security and equitable energy prices. It is in the end about saving innocent lives. In Ukraine, but also in other parts of the world. Let me close by congratulating you, Mr. President, on your successful presidency in the month of July. Thank you.
Representative of Germany for her statement. Now give the floor to the representative of Poland.
Mr. President, at the outset, I would like to thank Undersecretary Di Carlo for her very informative briefing on the very difficult situation brought upon Ukraine and the Ukrainian people by the aggression of Russian Federation. The brutal war of attrition Russia continues to wage against Ukraine, in spite of the repeated appeals made from the UN membership, affects us all and is felt in most corners of the world. Poland is appalled by the tragic human impact of the Russian aggression and will continue its support to Ukraine as long as it is necessary. Ukraine can count on the genuine and generous support of the Polish society, as well as the Polish government and local authorities. A recent report by the Polish Economic Institute indicates that only in the first 3 months of the war, as much as 70% of Poles got involved in helping Ukraine. That is 26.6 million people who opened their hearts to those in need. According to cautious estimates, my compatriots spent close to $2.2 billion out of their own pockets for this purpose. The total value of help for refugees and victims of the war assigned by the Polish authorities and provided by the Polish citizens during the first 90 days of the war amounted to almost 1% of the Polish GDP. Mr. President, with its invasion of Ukraine, Russia has violated the most fundamental principles of international law and its obligations it assumed on adoption of the UN Charter. We have heard this simple statement of fact several times today and hundreds of times since the February 24th. But it's worth repeating, though, as long as Kremlin regime keeps spreading its outlandish pseudo-legal justification for starting and persisting in this aggression. What Russia offers to the world today by no means can be defined as an alternative to the rule-based international order as the Russian authorities claims. What they rather try to do is to destroy the multilateral system by demolishing legal principles safeguarding us all from the scourge of war. If Russia is proposing anything, it is not an alternative, but a Ruski Mir, a model based on imperialism, colonialism, anarchy, the law of force, and spheres of influence. Let us have no doubts, such reshuffling is no better deal for the general membership of this organization. Would we be really better off in a world where there is no laws but the law of force? Secondly, while a country breaks the international law, it is difficult for the international community to treat it as trustworthy and dependable. Such a country undermines itself as a genuine party of international agreements or treaties. Just like the rest of the international community, Poland is grateful for the efforts of the Secretary General and the Turkey crowned by this grain agreement signed in Istanbul on July 27th. We fully support all initiatives aimed at mitigating the food crisis arising from the Russian aggression. However, how can we trust the sincerity of Russia, which, being a party of the agreement, one day signs the deal and in the less than 24 hours shells an area which is supposed to be the part of it? Such behavior from Russia amounts to nothing less but an act of self-exclusion. Unfortunately, it speaks volumes about the potential fate of any further peace negotiations. That's why we call on all the Security Council member states to help to secure the implementation of this agreement. Mr. President, I would like to remind the words of the Polish Foreign Minister, Mr. Zbigniew Rau, who during the recent Accountability for Ukraine conference in The Hague recalled the concept of the civilized nations, to which the statute of the International Court of Justice refers. It used to be considered as an obsolete and outdated concept. However, the ongoing barbaric aggression of Russia against the Ukraine seems to revive it and, in the same time, question it, together with the laws and values we have long considered to be established ones. It is of paramount importance to ensure the violation of international humanitarian law and international human rights law do not go unpunished and the justice is delivered to the victims. Poland fully supports the investigations carried out by the Ukrainian prosecutors, investigations initiated by the other states by making use of universal jurisdiction or other concepts, as well as the investigation of the ICC prosecutor. Mr. President, in the name of the UN Charter and the rules-based international order, we call on Russia to immediately stop its military aggression, withdraw its forces from the entire territory of Ukraine, and fully respect Ukrainian territorial integrity, sovereignty, and independence within its internationally recognized borders. We are saying "niet" to Ruski Mir. Thank you.
I thank the representative of Poland for his statement, and now we give the floor to the representative of Italy.
Mr. President, I would like to thank Brazil for organizing this timely briefing and USG Di Carlo for her insightful update of the situation on the ground. Italy aligns itself with the statement delivered by the representative of the European Union and would like to add some remarks in its national capacity. Italy welcomes the agreement reached in Istanbul to resume the crucial export of grains from Ukrainian Black Sea ports. Its full, swift and effective implementation is of utmost importance for the entire international community. It is a key mechanism to ensure access to food and prevent a worse food crisis, especially the most exposed and vulnerable countries in Africa, the Middle East and Southeast Asia, which cannot afford additional risks of famine. Mr. President, let me first commend the personal commitment and leadership of the Secretary General, as well as the action and key and tireless efforts of Martin Griffiths and Rebecca Greenspan and their teams that have been proven decisive in reaching this agreement. We also thank the outstanding engagement by Turkey to effectively channel diplomatic efforts while also hosting the Joint Coordination Center in Istanbul that will oversee departures from 3 Ukrainian ports and the implementation of the provision of the agreement. We hope that it will also be a positive step toward a wider diplomatic engagement. While reaffirming its unwavering support to Ukraine and the Ukrainian people, Italy stands firm in the strongest condemnation of the unjustified and unprovoked aggression by the Russian Federation. We are profoundly disturbed by the continuing attacks underlined by USG Di Carlo on civilians, including women and children, and by the testimonies and reports of war crimes, grave breaches of international humanitarian law, and serious violations of international human rights law perpetrated by the Russian armed forces. But also the global impacts of Russian aggression are becoming more and more evident by the day. Due to the constraints on agriculture production and distribution, price raising is exposing developing and vulnerable countries to multidimensional crises reported by the UN Global Crisis Response Group. Since the beginning of the war, millions of tons of grain have been stuck in Ukraine's Black Sea ports and even targeted by Russian shelling, triggering enormous humanitarian consequences on developing countries, condemning to starvation children, women and men far from the front line of the conflict. We should do everything in our capacity to mitigate, limit and address all the effects that this aggression is causing on developing countries all over the world. While we blame the Russian missile strikes in Odessa, the very same day after the signature of Istanbul, and again 3 days ago, we call particularly on Russia to swiftly, fully and in good faith implement the agreement in order to allow the grains export can quickly resume with a safe and secure passage of ships. Ultimately, to avoid further disruptions in food distribution, we urge Russia to stop the war without further delay. Italy will continue to actively support global food security, also by building upon the effective implementation of this agreement and as a host country of a major partner of the UN Rome-based agencies. I thank you.
I thank the representative of Italy for his statement, and I now will give the floor to the representative of Romania.
Mr. President, allow me from the outset to congratulate you for steering the work of the UN Security Council during the month of July, including in deciding to remain focused on the topic of peace and security in Ukraine. I would also like to thank Ms. Di Carlo for the encompassing and sobering report on the latest evolutions regarding Ukraine. Romania aligns itself with the statement of the EU delegation, delivered earlier, in condemning in the strongest terms the violation of the UN Charter by a permanent member of this Council, and the blatant attack on the rules-based international order. A neighbor to Ukraine, Romania has not only, quote, followed closely the ongoing events, unquote, but it has set in motion a wide range of concrete measures to tackle the consequences of the unprovoked and unjustifiable invasion of Ukraine by the Russian Federation. I would like to use this opportunity and inform the members of the UN Security Council of such actions taken in the field of refugees, food security, and accountability. While entering the 6th month of war, we have not forgotten our commitment to provide assistance to Ukrainian refugees seeking shelter in Romania. In order to provide predictability for the future of the Ukrainian refugees that enjoy temporary protection on our territory, this Tuesday, a national plan for medium and long-term integration of Ukrainian refugees in Romania was released by my government. The plan was put together with the help of partners from the United Nations agencies in Romania, civil societies, and relevant ministries. The plan has the full support of our Prime Minister and highlights Romania's commitment to helping Ukrainian refugees integrate smoothly in our country and be able to acquire personal independence without feeling all the effects of the war. The areas targeted in the plan are education, healthcare, employment, housing, childcare, and vulnerable groups, while both European and national funds will be employed to implement it. We commend the efforts of OCHA and UNCTAD under the direct and personal guidance of the UN Secretary General, as well as the efforts of Turkey throughout the latest months that culminated with the signing of the Istanbul Agreements and the inauguration 2 days ago of the Joint Coordination Center in Istanbul. Awaiting meaningful implementation of the Istanbul Agreements, Romania will continue to lend its support to ease food crisis pressures by continuing to facilitate the export of grains via alternative routes, including land, railways, the Danube River, and the Black Sea port of Constanța. So far, 2.7 million tons of Ukrainian cereals have already transited our territory. Romania hopes that the transport of grains and fertilizers from the Black Sea region to other countries will not be jeopardized. Good faith is essential in upholding and implementing what has been convened, as this is the best way to alleviate the current food crisis, increase humanitarian assistance, and support food production. The Russian missile strikes on Odessa's seaport, a crucial infrastructure for grain export, which took place a day after the signing of the Istanbul Agreements, has been strongly and widely condemned. Another dimension of the consequence of the war in Ukraine can be seen in the field of accountability. Almost all available judicial avenues have been activated to address the consequences of this unprovoked and unjustifiable invasion of Ukraine by the Russian Federation. A mobilization of this scale is extraordinary and requires a creative approach to coordinate efforts taking place at international, regional, and domestic levels in order to maximize efficiency. All initiatives aimed at ensuring accountability must be well balanced so as to avoid duplication of actions, make good use of resources, and, not least, to protect the interests of the victims who should not be further traumatized by multiple interviews during investigations and trials. There is clearly a momentum for international law and international humanitarian law, as the world is more united than ever by the goal of safeguarding the relevance and integrity of fundamental legal norms. These developments reinforce Romania's traditional stance on the matter, given that promoting respect for international law is one of the pillars of our national. It is in this spirit that Romania has already announced its intention to join the proceedings initiated by Ukraine against Russian Federation before the International Court of Justice in the case concerning allegations of genocide. The Romanian judicial authorities have also opened in rem investigations into the crimes against humanity allegedly committed on the territory of Ukraine based on the passive personality principle in conformity with our criminal code. To conclude, Mr. President, Romania would like to reconfirm its full solidarity with Ukraine and the Ukrainian people, while recalling the necessity to uphold the very principles of the UN Charter in preserving the independence, sovereignty, and territorial integrity of Ukraine within its internationally recognized borders. I thank you very much.
I thank the representative of Romania for her statement. There are no more names inscribed in the list of speakers. This meeting is adjourned.